Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio channel. Tonight we step into the first cruel edge of winter on the American frontier, where the air already tastes like iron and the trees stand bare as if they know something that you do not. You arrive with the season still pretending to be manageable, and that is part of the trick. A bright afternoon can fool you. A quiet sunset can flatter you. Even the ground, only lightly stiffened with frost, can seem almost polite. But then you notice the wagon ruts hardening, the water bucket wearing a skin of ice by dawn, and the way every person you meet glances at the sky as though it might hand down a sentence. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me your location and local time in the comments, because somewhere out there, another listener's probably getting sleepy under a very different sky. Now, dim the lights, and you step onto a patch of rough earth that will soon vanish under snow. At first, winter on the frontier does not arrive like a dramatic invasion. It comes in hints. You wake to brittle grass that snaps under your boots. Your breath appears in pale little clouds. The creek near the settlement runs slower each morning, with thin silver rims of ice gathering along the edges. The world is still open, still passable, still pretending to be generous. That is when the real work begins. You learn very quickly that frontier people did not prepare for winter in a single burst of heroism. They prepared in 1,000 ordinary motions. A woman shakes out a coarse blanket and studies its thinning places. A boy gathers chips of wood from the yard because even scraps matter now. A man tests the cabin door with his shoulder, then stuffs another strip of cloth into the gap where the wind sneaks through. Nothing looks grand. Everything matters. The American frontier was never one neat place. Of course, it stretched across forests, river valleys, plains, and mountain edges over different centuries. Winter in upstate New York did not feel like winter in Kentucky, and neither felt quite like a cold season in Minnesota or the high interior West. But across those regions, a harsh truth stayed the same. Distance made cold more dangerous. When towns were scattered, roads poor and supplies uncertain, even an ordinary winter could feel like an opponent with endless patience. You sense that patience all around you. The trees hold still. Crows call from the branches with that blunt, unromantic voice they have, as if even the birds cannot be bothered with niceties. The smell of smoke begins to cling to everything. It hangs in your coat, settles in your hair, seeps into the wool blankets and the corners of the cabin. By late autumn, the whole settlement seems to smell of wood smoke, damp leather, animal sweat, and earth cooling into sleep. There is a common picture of frontier life that loves summer. Sunlit cabins, cornfields waving, children running near split-rail fences. Very nice. Very painterly. Winter ruins that fantasy with tremendous efficiency. The frontier in winter is less about picturesque bravery and more about whether you remember to mend a hinge, dry the firewood, salt enough meat, and patch the roof before the first heavy snow. Romance, as it turns out, does not stop drafts. You begin by looking at food with new seriousness, not enjoying it, studying it, flour barrels, sacks of cornmeal, beans, dried apples, smoked meat, rendered fat, salt, root vegetables if the cellar is good enough. These are not pantry items now. They are calendar items. Every handful has to mean something. Every meal becomes a small act of arithmetic. A spoonful taken today is a spoonful not there in February, when the world may be white, silent, and deeply unhelpful. Many frontier families depended on a mix of hunting, preserving, small harvests, and trade. If the harvest had failed, winter felt dangerous before it even began. If a hog had not been butchered in time, or a corn crop had spoiled, there would be no cheerful recovery plan. Historians still argue how often frontier hunger became true famine in ordinary settlements, because records usually preserve the worst disasters or the proudest successes, while the quieter weeks of thin meals and private worry went mostly unwritten. Human beings are funny that way. We write down the blizzard. We forget the long, dull fear of the cupboard. The sounds around you change too. Summer is full of insects, voices, wagon creaks, tools, and distance. Cold weather narrows sound, A single axe stroke can ring through the trees like metal striking glass. Boots on frozen ground make a harder rhythm. Cabin floors groan at night as timbers tighten. Wind slips under the eaves with a thin whistle that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It is not loud all the time. That might be easier. Instead, it is persistent. And then there is the first real warning morning. You wake before sunrise because the cold has reached your face. The blanket feels heavy but not generous. When you sit up, the air bites the inside of your nose. The wash basin has frozen over. The pitcher near the wall holds water with a pale crust of ice across the top. You can hear someone outside already, chopping wood in deliberate strokes because no sensible person waits for comfort to become an emergency. The smell in the cabin is part ash, part damp wool, part yesterday's supper. Your fingertips sting. The floorboards are fierce with cold through your stockings. Sleep leaves you quickly. Winter has excellent manners for waking people. That first hard frost tells everyone the same thing. Whatever is not ready will soon stay not ready. So you watch the settlement hurry. Fences are checked before drifting snow hides their weak places. Extra chinking is pushed into cabin cracks with cold, reddened hands. Firewood is stacked under any shelter available because dry wood burns cleaner and hotter, and wet logs are nearly an insult. Livestock are counted, inspected, and fed more carefully. People talk about hay as if discussing treasure, because that is exactly what it is. On many parts of the frontier, animals were survival itself. A cow meant milk if she remained healthy enough. A horse or ox meant hauling, ploughing, movement, possibility. Chickens meant eggs, when weather and feed allowed it. Pigs meant meat, lard, and practical hope in edible form. Keeping animals alive through winter was exhausting. Water had to be broken free from ice. Feed had to stretch. Shelter had to hold. A weakened animal could mean less food, less labour, and less chance of recovery in spring. Frontier people often spoke of livestock with blunt pragmatism. But beneath that tone was anxiety. You do not stay calm when your dinner, transport, and savings account all have hooves. A quirky little truth from some frontier communities is that people sometimes use snow itself as a kind of notebook. Tracks near the cabin told stories before breakfast. Deer, rabbit, fox, stray dog, a neighbour approaching, livestock wandering where they should not. All of it could be read in the white ground. A skilled eye could learn who had passed, when, and with what purpose. Snow was inconvenient, yes, but it was also nosy. As the days shorten, light becomes an object you notice almost physically. Afternoon seems to collapse too early. Golden light fades into grey before the chores are done. Candles and lamps are not cosy decorations. They cost effort. Tallow has to be rendered. Wicks have to be made. Oil has to be acquired. You begin to understand why people once moved with the sun not because they were poetic, but because darkness was expensive. The body responds before the mind catches up. Your hands roughen, your skin dries and pulls at the knuckles. Cold water shocks the wrists like a reprimand. Wool scratches your neck, leather stiffens, the air itself feels thinner, sharper, less forgiving. There is a constant awareness of surfaces. The smooth handle of a bucket chilled by dawn, the splintered grain of a cabin wall, the chalky feel of ash near the hearth, the strange comfort of standing close enough to a fire that one side of your body warms while the other remains stubbornly cold. Meals become heavier when possible. Cornbread, salt pork, beans, stews, whatever can fill the stomach and linger there. In some places, people relied on dishes that would seem plain to us. But plain food has a certain moral confidence in hard weather. It does not flirt. It does not perform. It arrives hot, if you are lucky. And that is enough. Dried apple pie, when there is one, tastes almost luxurious. Molasses, if available, feels like a small act of celebration. Coffee, tea, or substitutes brewed from roasted grains carry warmth into the hands before they ever reach the mouth. Yet food was never only about calories. It was also about mood. A better supper could steady a household after a hard day. A poor one could sharpen tempers already scraped raw by fatigue. Winter pressed families close together in cramped spaces, and close living has a way of polishing every human flaw until it shines. A loud chewer becomes a villain. A forgotten chore becomes a personal insult. Someone is always opening the door too long and letting the heat out. Civilization survives by a thread, apparently. You also notice how quickly clothing becomes serious business. Linen shifts and shirts are no match for deep cold alone. Wool blankets, shawls, mittens, stockings, caps, petticoats, heavy coats, moccasins or boots. All of it matters, especially if conditions turn wet. Dampness is the sly enemy. Snow on the hem, melted slush near a doorway, sweat trapped under layers while chopping wood. These can chill the body later with nasty efficiency. Many families patched garments repeatedly, turning old cloth into new usefulness. Sleeves were mended, socks darned, coats altered. A worn blanket might become a child's wrapping, then a draught stopper, then a final rag near the hearth. Nothing retired with dignity, it simply kept working. Frontier children learned this season fast. They might enjoy the first powdering of snow, of course. Children are loyal to delight even when conditions argue otherwise. But they also fetched water, carried kindling, watched younger siblings, gathered eggs before they froze, and learned not to waste heat. There were games, songs, and laughter. Yes, but childhood on the frontier was braided tightly with labour. A child could be cherished and still expected to work. Those two things were not seen as opposites. There is also the question of time, and winter changes that in a very strange way. Days feel short, weeks feel long. The first frost, the first lasting snow, the first pond frozen thick enough to tempt foolish boys. The first day the road becomes hard to travel. People mark these like milestones. A season of survival teaches you to think in thresholds, not dates, conditions. Some settlers arrived with knowledge shaped in older communities. They knew how to smoke meat, bank a fire, or store root vegetables in a cellar. Others came with optimism, which is not the same thing at all. A few hard lessons returned again and again across frontier life. Build before the weather turns, cut more wood than seems necessary, protect grain from damp and pests. Do not trust a mild November. The weather loves making confident people look silly. There were also cultural habits carried from Europe, from indigenous communities, and from older colonial settlements, often blending in practical ways. Native peoples across North America had long developed winter knowledge suited to local climates, from travel methods to food storage to shelter techniques. Some settlers learned from that wisdom, whether freely acknowledged or not. Others ignored it, which was a very frontier way to make life harder than required. Scholars still disagree about the full extent of everyday borrowing between communities, because practical exchange often left fewer neat records than treaties, sermons, or military reports. But the evidence that survives suggests winter encouraged learning, even among people not naturally gifted with humility. As evening settles over the settlement, smoke lifts straight upward in the still air. The sky fades from pewter to deep blue. Somewhere a dog barks once, then gives up on conversation. The cold reaches through your coat with careful fingers. From inside the cabin comes the pop of resin in the firewood and the low murmur of tired voices. Supper is simple. The room is close. Shadows waver on the wall. Outside waits the dark yard, the stacked wood, the frozen path, the silent trees. You sit there and understand something that summer never teaches. On the frontier, winter survival begins long before the snow grows deep. It begins in attention, in noticing the weak latch, the low barrel, the frayed mitten, the thin cow, the shrinking daylight, the smell of colder air moving in before sunset. Life here is not undone by one grand mistake. It is worn down by little oversights, one after another, until the season takes advantage. So you listen more carefully, you move more deliberately, you learn the feel of frost underfoot, the taste of smoke in the throat, the ache of cold wood in your palms. The world is tightening around you, slowly, almost politely. And everyone around you knows what that means. Winter has not fully arrived yet. That would be too simple. For now, It is only watching the cabin, the fields, the animals, and you, waiting to see whether all this preparation will be enough. You begin with the walls, because the wind has already introduced itself, and you do not care for its personality. It comes thin and sharp across the clearing, slides through every careless seam, and turns a cabin from shelter into a wooden sieve. From the outside, the place can look almost sturdy. Rough logs sit one over another. The roof slopes properly enough. A chimney rises with admirable confidence. But step inside on a cold evening, and the truth becomes painfully obvious. The air moves where it should not. A flame leans sideways on the hearth. The back of your neck stays cold no matter where you stand. Frontier housing had a talent for appearing solid while behaving like a basket. So you set about arguing with the structure. Building a winter cabin on the American frontier was rarely a graceful business. Many settlers wanted something better than they actually had time, tools, or money to create. A polished house with tight joints, good flooring, decent plaster, and a proper glazed window was a fine dream. A rough log cabin thrown up before bad weather was the more common reality. Plenty of families first lived in what was essentially an emergency box, and then spent months, or years, improving it piece by piece. Winter did not wait for improvement. The logs themselves mattered. Straight trunks were easier to stack and seal. Hardwood was often prized for strength and durability, though what you used depended heavily on what stood nearby. Pine, oak, chestnut, hickory, maple, poplar, all might appear in frontier structures depending on region and availability. Historians disagree about how representative the familiar image of the ideal log cabin really is, because surviving examples and nostalgic paintings often favour neat craftsmanship, while many actual dwellings were cruder, smaller, and patched in ways no painter would bother to celebrate. People do love to memorialise the tidy version of hardship. You walk around the cabin and study the notches where the logs meet at the corners. Some are cut well and hold snug. Others leave narrow gaps that seem harmless, until the temperature drops and a draught begins exploring your ankles like a particularly rude house guest. Between the logs sits the great frontier obsession of winter housing, chinking. This is the material shoved into gaps to block moving air and, one hopes, preserve a little warmth inside. The filler might be mud, clay, moss, straw, sticks, rags, or a mixture of several things. Good chinking takes patience. Bad chinking takes 5 minutes and then laughs at you all winter. The work is tactile in the least glamorous way possible. Your fingers press wet clay into cracks. Straw scratches your palms. Bits of dried mud crumble down your sleeves. Cold dampness settles into your skin while you force one handful after another into stubborn spaces between the logs. Sometimes a stick must be wedged first, then plastered over. Sometimes a crack you thought small turns out to run farther than expected. The wall, naturally, never finishes being needy. Inside, the smell of fresh mud mingles with smoke and old timber. It is earthy, sour, faintly alive. The walls look less like a home than a repaired wound. Yet each sealed gap changes the room. You can feel it. The draught weakens. The fire burns with less frantic flutter. Silence gathers a little more easily. Warmth on the frontier was not only generated, it was defended. Windows present a special challenge. Glass was precious and not always available in generous quantities. Some cabins had very small panes. Some used oiled paper in place of glass for a time. Oiled paper let in a blurred, weak light but offered less protection and less clear vision. Imagine squinting through a greasy cloud while the weather judges you. It worked. After a fashion. That phrase covers much of frontier engineering. A larger window meant more light, but also more cold unless it was built and sealed carefully. Many families accepted dim interiors because brightness came with a price. You notice how daylight enters the cabin in narrow slabs, pale and limited, catching dust in the air and briefly illuminating the uneven floor. By late afternoon, the room withdraws into brown shadows. A person learns to value a square of sunlight on a wall the way a modern soul might value central heating and stable internet. One of those is easier to survive without, though opinions vary. Then there is the door. Cabin doors could be heavy plank constructions, made from split boards and braced with crosspieces, or they could be rougher affairs depending on tools and skill. A badly fitted door is winter's invitation card. Air leaks around the edges, snow may drift against the threshold, the latch freezes, the wood swells and shrinks with moisture and cold. You push at it, test it, shave a bit here, stuff cloth there, lay something along the sill. The goal is not perfection. The goal is to stop waking up feeling as if the outdoors slept in the room with you. Roofs demand equal suspicion. A roof can look perfectly respectable until rain or melting snow proves otherwise. Shingles, clapboards, bark, thatch, or split boards might serve depending on region and resources. Weight matters. So does pitch. So does whether a storm takes offence at your design. If smoke blackens the rafters but the roof stays dry, you count that as victory. If it drips onto bedding in January, the mood worsens immediately. You climb up on a crisp morning while frost still silvers the edges of the boards. The air smells of sap, wet leaves pressed into earth, and distant smoke from other cabins making their own defensive preparations. Under your boots the roof feels cold and slightly rough, each board carrying a faint grain against the sole. You replace a loose piece, hammer something into place, wedge material where a seam looks questionable. This is frontier architecture at work. Less grandeur, more muttering. One mainstream fact of frontier settlement is that cabins were often built fast by neighbours, working together in what later generations called a raising. Men would cut and notch logs, then lift them into place with communal labour. Such gatherings could be practical and social all at once. They were necessary because a family alone might take far longer to raise even a modest structure. Yet once the walls stood, the finishing details often lagged behind. Floors, doors, chimneys, loft spaces, interior partitions, these could remain imperfect for a long time. Winter exposed every unfinished thought. Chimneys deserve their own respect and suspicion. Many early cabins had chimneys of stone if materials and skill allowed. Others made do with clay and sticks in a construction sometimes called a stick and mud chimney. It sounds temporary because it also sounds flammable because it was that too. Sparks, heat, and dry materials make a lively combination. House fires haunted frontier life, especially in winter when fires burned longer and more often. A cabin that kept out wind but invited flames was merely choosing a different enemy. The hearth became the emotional centre of the room, though not always the thermal centre. That is an important frontier disappointment. Fireplaces looked comforting, and they certainly provided heat nearby. But they could also pull warm air up the chimney with outrageous greed. Stand close and one side of you roasts while the other remains unconvinced. Still, the hearth mattered beyond simple warmth. It was where food was cooked, tools dried, socks warmed, stories told, and illnesses watched. The sound of a steady fire had its own power. That rhythmic settling and popping of wood, the whisper of flame catching resin, the low crumble of embers, it told you the cabin was still fighting for you. You kneel near the fireplace and feel the floorboards gritty under your hand. Ash dust softens the cracks between them. A black iron pot hangs ready. Nearby, split wood waits in a stack that never looks large enough. The warmth on your face is pleasant, almost generous. But your back feels the chill reaching from the room behind. This is frontier comfort, partial, conditional, and deeply appreciated anyway. Some households tried to improve matters with interior linings, hanging blankets, or extra wall coverings to block drafts. Cloth tacked along a wall could soften a room and trap a little warmth. Animal hides might serve similarly in some regions. A bed pushed into the warmest corner and enclosed with curtains could create a microclimate of precious coziness. Bed curtains were not mere decoration in earlier homes, they were strategy. Sleep is easier when the air around your face does not feel personally offended by your existence. Furniture also had to adapt to the cabin's realities. Beds were often simple frames with rope supports, poles or slats, topped with straw ticks. Feather beds if fortune smiled, quilts, blankets, and whatever layering the household could manage. Straw stuffing flattened, shifted and rustled. It smelled faintly dry and grassy when fresh, more stale as time passed. Quilts carried the scent of smoke and clean cold air if aired outside. A warm bed after a freezing evening could feel almost holy. A cold bed at the start of the night felt like punishment for unknown sins. Not every family lived in a classic one-room cabin, but many did, especially at first. When several people share a single main room, the house becomes a universe of negotiated space. Cooking happens near the hearth. Wet boots gather by the door. Tools occupy corners. Bedding claims precious room at night. Children, adults, supplies, and sometimes small animals can all end up within the same smoky envelope. Privacy narrows. Sounds multiply. A cough in the dark belongs to everyone. There is a quirky detail from some accounts that people sometimes hung strips of fabric, old hats, or even bunches of herbs near problem drafts simply to observe how badly the air moved. Watch the cloth stir, and you learn the wall is lying to you. It is frontier science with very low funding, still effective. Floors range from bare earth to puncheon planks split and smoothed on one side. Dirt floors were cheaper and faster but colder, damper and less clean. Plank floors improved comfort but were not always perfectly fitted. Dust slipped between boards. Small objects vanished into cracks with suspicious enthusiasm. In winter, a floor told the truth about the house. Cold rising from below could undo the best fire. You scatter rugs if you have them, or extra skins, or anything that interrupts that upward creep of chill. Storage posed another challenge. A secure cabin had to shelter not only bodies but food, tools, seed, clothing, and hope in material form. Hooks in the rafters kept items from rodents. Barrels lined the wall. Bundles hung from pegs. Shelves held crockery and whatever provisions had survived transport and weather. Space was never enough. The cabin might appear plain, yet every inch had a purpose. Disorder was not simply ugly, it could become dangerous. Lose a mitten in a cluttered room on a bitter morning and your opinion of organisation rises dramatically. You also learn that orientation matters. A cabin placed with regard to sun, slope, drainage, and prevailing wind stood a better chance of being tolerable. Settlers did not always have the luxury of perfect sighting, but they noticed quickly when a doorway faced the worst weather, or when snow collected hard against a wall. Water running under a house and freezing was no small concern. Mud around the foundation became cold, then harder, then troublesome. Land had moods, and a wise builder noticed them. Indigenous building traditions across North America had long responded intelligently to local winter conditions, using forms and materials suited to climate. In some regions, settlers borrowed building ideas, roofing approaches, insulation methods, or siting knowledge, though the record is uneven and often incomplete. Scholars still debate how often these lessons were acknowledged openly, rather than absorbed and later treated as common sense. Practical knowledge has a funny habit of losing its original owner once it becomes useful enough. Toward evening, as the sky pales and then deepens, the cabin settles into itself. The logs exhale the day's stored chill. Smoke threads upward. A little warmth gathers at knee-height near the fire. The walls, newly packed and patched, hold a calmer stillness than before. You notice it not as luxury, but as reduced suffering, which is close enough to luxury for frontier standards. The door closes with less complaint. The window rattles but does not tremble. Wind scratches at the roof and finds fewer openings to exploit. You sit on a stool that wobbles slightly because, of course, it does. The wood beneath your hand is smooth in one place, splintery in another. You smell supper beginning to warm and hear the low clink of iron against iron by the hearth. In the corner, bedding waits in folds. Above, the rafters disappear into shadow. The room remains small, rough, and imperfect. Yet it has shifted. It no longer feels like a temporary shelter hoping for mercy. It feels like a defended space. That distinction matters more than pride. On the American frontier, surviving winter required constant labour. But that labour was also psychological. Every sealed crack, braced hinge, repaired roof board, and steadied chimney turned fear into a task with edges you could grasp. The weather remained powerful. Distance remained dangerous. Supplies remained finite. None of that vanished. But a better cabin altered the terms of the struggle. It gave you a place to return to at dusk, where the wind did not own every corner, and when night finally thickens outside, pressing against the little window and the patched walls, you understand the real purpose of all this work. A frontier house in winter was never simply a building, it was a stubborn claim, a wooden statement made in smoke, mud, effort, and cold hands. It said that for one more night, at least, the dark could stay outside. By the time the cold settles properly over the frontier, you stop thinking about food as something pleasant and begin treating it like a ledger. Every scoop, slice, pinch, and ladle has consequences. The flour barrel is no longer a comforting sight. It is a question. How deep is it really? How tightly should the lid stay closed? How much vanished this week without anyone quite noticing? Hunger does not usually stride in wearing a villain's cape. It arrives in teaspoons. Morning begins with a scrape of a ladle inside a pot, and the dry rustle of meal being measured out with care that almost feels suspicious. The cabin smells of ashes revived from the night, damp wool steaming near the hearth, and the faint sweetness of stored corn. You stand close enough to the fire to warm your hands, but not so close that precious fuel is wasted on idleness. That is how winter teaches manners. Even standing can feel extravagant. On the American frontier, families try to enter winter with stores laid by, but the margin between enough and not enough could be terrifyingly thin. Cornmeal, flour, beans, dried peas, salt pork, smoked meat, lard, molasses, apples, pumpkins, turnips, potatoes, and whatever else the household had managed to preserve or barter, formed the backbone of winter eating in many settlements. The exact mix changed by region and season. Of course, a river settlement with access to trade looked different from an isolated cabin deeper inland. Still, one truth remained steady. Food had to last longer than optimism. You begin to notice how people look at shelves and barrels, not casually, respectfully. A sack of beans leaning in the corner becomes almost noble. A crock of preserved meat inspires the sort of gratitude usually reserved for saints. Even a string of dried apples hanging from a peg has a quiet dignity. These things have survived weather, distance, pests, and human temptation. They deserve admiration. The meals themselves are rarely dramatic. Porridge in the morning, perhaps cornmeal mush, perhaps bread fried in grease if luck is with you. A midday bite grabbed between chores. Supper built around whatever can be stretched into a stew. Salt pork appears often because pigs were useful in so many practical and edible ways. Beans appear often because they store well and know their role. Bread, when there is flour enough, becomes the centre of emotional life with very little fuss. A warm loaf in winter can make a room soften all at once, but every comforting dish carries a calculation beneath it. Use too much fat now and February will become moral instruction. Bake too often and flour sinks faster than expected. Feed guests generously, and you feel virtuous until you look again at the shelf. Refuse guests and you feel like a villain, which is awkward when they live nearby and own a musket you may someday wish to borrow. Frontier society had many opportunities for practical ethics. Salt mattered enormously. It preserved meat, seasoned food, and helped keep provisions usable through the long, cold months. Without enough salt, a family could lose precious stores to spoilage. Salt was not glamorous, but then neither is survival. On some parts of the frontier, hauling or purchasing enough of it took real planning and effort. You handle it carefully, pinching crystals between finger and thumb, aware that such small things can govern a season. The cellar, if the household has one, becomes a kingdom of guarded treasure. You open the rough door and a cool earthen smell rises up to meet you. It is damp, mineral, faintly sweet from stored roots, and touched with that dark scent of underground stillness. Potatoes rest in bins. Turnips and onions wait in piles or baskets. Apples, if they have kept well, release a mellow fragrance into the chill air. Each item seems patient. Each one is also perishable. That is the frontier joke. Your best provisions are slowly dying, just more politely than you are. You run a hand over a sack and feel the coarse weave against your skin. Dust clings to your fingers. Somewhere in the corner a faint rustle makes you turn your head at once. because rodents are winter opportunists of exceptional confidence. Mice and rats do not care that you chopped wood in freezing wind or carried grain over difficult roads. They simply arrive, chew, breed, and behave as if the house exists for their convenience. A family that lost food to pests might face real danger later in the season, so traps, cats, hanging storage, sealed containers, and constant vigilance all had their place. There is nothing like frontier life to turn you into a suspicious guardian of turnips. One mainstream fact of rural winter survival is that preservation methods shape the diet as much as farming itself. Drying, smoking, salting, pickling, and storing in cool conditions made the difference between a useful harvest and a memory. Fresh meat was a luxury of timing, often tied to butchering in colder weather when spoilage slowed. Fresh greens nearly vanished for long stretches unless special techniques or local conditions allowed otherwise. This meant nutrition could become uneven. Bodies felt the absence of variety even when bellies were not entirely empty, and sometimes bellies were not entirely full either. That is the frontier state you begin to understand best. Not dramatic starvation, at least not at first. Not grand tragedy with violins. Just a persistent narrowing. Portions shrink a little. The second helping disappears. The bread is sliced thinner. Grease is saved more carefully after frying. Soup grows broader in water and more philosophical in content. A person says they are not especially hungry, which is often a sentimental lie told for the good of the household. The sounds of cooking carry a curious emotional weight. The bubbling of a kettle can comfort you before it even reveals what is inside. The crackle of crust in a skillet is almost indecently cheerful. A spoon striking the side of an iron pot sounds plain. But on a dark winter evening it can feel like reassurance. Food on the frontier is sensory in a concentrated way because it is so bound up with security. The smell of onions softening in fat, the steam rising from beans, the rich salt smell of pork warming by the hearth. These are not merely appetizing, they are stabilizing. Yet appetite is a troublemaker. Hard work in the cold sharpens it ferociously. Chopping wood, hauling water, carrying feed, mending fences, walking through snow. All of it asks much from the body. You return indoors flushed, aching, and hungry enough to imagine heroic portions. The pot, however, has other opinions. So you eat slowly, you mop up the last grease with bread, you chew in a measured way, not because manners demand it, but because slowness can trick the stomach into thinking the meal was larger than it was. Human dignity survives in strange forms. There is also the matter of taste fatigue. A modern pantry can distract you with endless options. The frontier winter table could be repetitive enough to make a saint irritable. Cornmeal again, pork again, beans again, dried apples again. This was not a failure of imagination. It was the arithmetic of storage. Still, people found ways to vary texture and flavour where they could. A pie on a special day, molasses in bread, a handful of spices if any remained from trade, vinegar-sharpened dishes, wild game, if caught, interrupted monotony with welcome authority. Hunting during winter could supplement the household, but it was no magical solution. Game might be scarce, weather harsh, travel difficult, and ammunition valuable. Deer, rabbit, squirrel, wild turkey, and other animals could make a meaningful difference depending on region and skill. But you do not gamble the whole season on the hope that the woods will donate supper. Hope does not cure an empty larder. Scholars still debate how often frontier families concealed hunger in their own writings out of pride, embarrassment, or simple habit. Diaries may mention scarcity with startling calm or else glide past it in a single sentence, as if reduced meals were too ordinary to deserve drama. That leaves historians peering between the lines, searching inventories, weather records, prices, and local accounts for hints of how hard a particular winter truly was. Hunger often leaves a quieter paper trail than battle or disease, though it can shape lives just as thoroughly. You see that quietness in the faces round the settlement. No one announces fear every morning. That would be exhausting. Instead, people asked practical questions with unusual precision. How much meal left? Any luck with the trap line? Did the neighbour get his hog salted in time? Is the creek passable enough for trade? Could someone spare a little seed grain? Or is that request already too dangerous to make? The talk sounds ordinary, but underneath it runs a current of worry as constant as water beneath ice. Children experience this world differently, though not always more easily. A child might complain of sameness or beg for a larger portion with heartbreaking honesty. Another may learn to keep quiet, reading adults closely enough to sense restraint in the room. Some frontier accounts describe parents trying to shield the youngest from the full reality of shortages by skipping their own share or inventing reasons they were not hungry. Parenthood has always involved a degree of theatre. Winter simply raises the stakes and lowers the lighting. A quirky detail from some communities is that coffee substitutes became part of daily routine, not just from preference but from necessity. Roasted rye, corn, barley, peas, chicory, or other ingredients might be brewed into dark, bitter drinks when imported coffee was scarce or costly. These beverages were not identical to the real thing, and nobody with a functioning tongue was truly fooled. Still, the ritual mattered. A hot cup in cold hands, steam rising toward your face, bitterness on the tongue, warmth in the chest, that could restore more than the body. It restored normality, or something dressed very convincingly as it. Bread itself becomes a kind of frontier weather report. If there is enough flour for a proper loaf, spirits rise. If the bread grows denser, darker, mixed with more corn or other extenders, everyone notices without comment. If baking yields to boiled mush more often, that says something too. The table announces the condition of the household more honestly than conversation. You come to understand that women often bore much of the mental burden of winter food management, though the labour belonged to the whole household. Planning, preserving, cooking, stretching ingredients, monitoring stores, deciding what could be spared and what must be guarded. These tasks required sharp judgment. Men hunted, butchered, hauled, traded, and worked for provisions as well. Certainly. But the constant intimate negotiation with the pantry often took place in female hands. A frontier kitchen was not a quaint domestic corner. It was command central with soot. The physical experience of slight hunger has its own texture. You feel lighter, but not in a pleasant way. Your stomach does not roar all the time. It tugs. Your thoughts drift more often toward the next meal. The smell of frying meat can seem almost rude in its intensity. Hands stay colder. Patience shortens. A simple task grows oddly irritating. Then supper comes and the body quiets for a while, grateful but not fully persuaded. This is not famine. Not yet. It is the long approach of it, held back by discipline and luck. Trade could rescue a household or fail it utterly. If roads iced over, rivers froze strangely, or neighbouring families were short themselves. Exchange became difficult. Goods that seemed available in autumn might become unreachable in midwinter. Even where small stores or trading posts existed, prices could rise or supplies run out. A frontier family that depended too heavily on buying its way through winter might learn a stern lesson about distance and weather. You sit one evening at a rough table scarred by knives and years of use. A candle flames low, giving off that warm, faintly fatty smell of tallow. The spoon in your hand is smooth along the handle, where many fingers have polished it. The stew is hot enough to fog the air before your face. Beans, bits of pork, perhaps onion, perhaps not much more. It is good. It is not enough to be careless with. Around you the room holds that deep winter hush, broken only by chewing, a log settling in the fire, someone clearing a throat. The meal is small, but it gathers the household into one warm orbit. This is where the frontier winter presses hardest against the spirit, not in one dramatic moment, but in repetition. You're always counting, always considering, always aware that one spoiled barrel, one failed hunt, one sick cow, one blizzard delaying travel, one careless week in the kitchen could tilt the balance. The food in the house is not simply nourishment, it is time. Every stored potato is a little more time. Every strip of dried meat is another few meals. Every handful of meal surviving in the bin is a promise that morning can still be answered. And still, people found ways to make eating more than grim necessity. A pie on a holy day, a better cut of meat shared when a neighbour visited, maple sugar if the region allowed and the season turned right, children licking molasses from a spoon with the solemn concentration of scholars, someone laughing because the bread rose unexpectedly well for once. These moments mattered because they insisted that life was not only about getting through. Even on the harshest frontier table, pleasure tried to keep a seat. When you finally lie down at night, the smell of the supper fire still clings to your clothes. Your belly is warm, though not heavy. Somewhere in the dark, a barrel waits. A cellar waits. The last of some ingredient waits to be stretched farther than seems decent. Winter hunger rarely shouts at first. It breathes quietly in the pantry. It watches every meal. It listens to every crumb hitting the table. And on the frontier, you learn to listen back. Snow changes the scale of everything. A short walk becomes a task. A simple errand becomes an expedition with frozen fingers and a damp hem. Even the yard outside the cabin seems to expand when the drifts rise, and the path disappears under a fresh fall. You wake into a white world that reflects every scrap of dawn, pale and severe, and for one sleepy second it can look beautiful enough to forgive. Then your toes touch the cold floor, and beauty is forced to defend itself. The first work of the morning is not ambition, it is recovery. The fire has to be coaxed back from embers, and that means kneeling close to the hearth with stiff hands, arranging kindling, blowing carefully, listening for the small dry tick as flame takes hold. Smoke curls low for a moment, stinging your eyes. The room smells of ash, old wood, and the slightly sour wool of blankets that trapped the night's breath. When the first real warmth begins to spread, it does not flood the cabin. It arrives in narrow mercy. You dress with strategy, not style. Shirt, stockings, petticoat or trousers, outer layers, wool where possible, anything that might stand between your skin and the season's bad intentions. Cloth feels cold at first contact. Leather is stubborn. A coat lifted from its peg carries the smell of smoke, sweat, and outside air. Boots, if they are dry, feel like a blessing. If they are still damp from yesterday, they feel like a personal betrayal. Frontier life offers many chances to develop opinions about footwear. Then comes water. The bucket near the door stands ready, empty or nearly so, because water is never just there in a frontier winter. Someone must go for it. If the nearest source is a spring, creek, or well, the route must be crossed in cold that makes the inside of your nose ache and your eyes water. Snow squeaks underfoot in severe weather, a crisp and oddly delicate sound. On milder days it compresses with a wetter crunch. Wind skims over the open ground and finds every gap in your clothing. The air smells clean in the way only bitter cold can smell clean, almost metallic, almost empty, carrying a faint trace of wood smoke from chimneys behind you. At the well, the rope feels rough and unfriendly against your glove or bare palm. At the creek, ice may have to be broken. At the spring, the footing can be treacherous, packed snow glazed with slick spots that wait quietly for your dignity to fail. You lift, balance, turn, and carry. Water sloshes against the sides of the bucket and chills your wrist where it splashes. By the time you return, your fingers burn with that deep cold sting that feels almost hot. And this is before breakfast has properly begun. That is the rhythm of winter daily life on the American frontier. Survival rarely depends on one grand act. It depends on recurring, unavoidable chores that must be done when you are tired, cold, and not especially inspired. Water, wood, feed, fire, meals, mending, cleaning, watching, hauling, repeating. The work is not glamorous enough for myth, which is probably why it mattered so much. A mainstream fact that often disappears from romantic frontier stories is just how labour-intensive winter housekeeping and maintenance were. Soot gathered, ash had to be removed. Laundry became an ordeal because water needed heating, and wet cloth dried slowly in cold conditions. Floors tracked in mud, snow, straw, and bits of bark. Bedding needed airing when weather allowed. Tools required drying and care so they would not rust or split. A cabin never truly stayed set in order. It slipped toward disorder the moment you stopped paying attention. Breakfast, if that is what it can be called, is often quick and practical. Porridge, bread, cold leftovers reheated, maybe a little salt meat. Steam rises from the bowl and warms your face while the rest of you still feels unconvinced. Wooden spoons knock softly against crockery. Someone shifts on a stool. A child rubs sleepy eyes with a red knuckles. The light outside strengthens, but never quite brightens. Winter mornings often seem to hesitate. Then the outside work begins in earnest. Paths must be cleared, at least roughly, from cabin to woodpile, from cabin to animal shelter, from cabin to wherever the day's needs insist you go. Shovels bite into packed snow with a dull scrape. In places where the drift is too high, or the tool too poor, boots simply trample a narrow route into submission. The snow against your leggings or stockings can melt and seep inward. That dampness is dangerous in a sly, annoying way. It starts as discomfort and turns into cold that follows you indoors. The woodpile draws you daily, sometimes several times. Fire consumes security with astonishing speed. Each log handled leaves a dry roughness on your skin and the scent of split timber on your clothes. Frozen wood has a different feel from summer wood, harder, more resonant under the axe. A clean strike rings through the air with a sharp report that seems to travel for miles through the stillness. The sound can be almost musical if music had sore shoulders. You stack what you bring inside near the hearth, but not too near. Frontier life is a long education in distance. Too close and the wood may catch or the room become cluttered with danger. Too far and it stays damp or awkwardly placed. The cabin floor around the hearth becomes a zone of constant adjustment. Pots moved, boots turned, mittens drying, wood rotated, ash swept. Everything in motion, everything with a reason. Women, men, and children all shared in this winter machinery. Though the tasks divided by age, skill, custom, and necessity, a child could bring chips and kindling, gather eggs, shake blankets, shell beans, stir a pot, or watch a sibling. An older girl might spend hours spinning, sewing, or preparing food while also helping outside. A boy might haul wood, carry water, feed animals, and learn the exact level of competence required to avoid being sent back out to do it properly. Nobody, however, stayed entirely outside the economy of chores. Even idleness had to justify itself with illness, injury, or infancy. Spinning and mending fill many indoor hours. The wheel hums and clicks with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. Needle through cloth, thread pulled taut, worn elbow patched, mitten repaired, seam reinforced. These quiet labours sound soft, but they shape winter survival as much as chopping wood does. A torn sleeve lets in cold, a weak quilt fails a bed, a split-grain sack spills food. Textile work on the frontier was never ornamental by default. It was defence by finer means. Historians still argue over how monotonous winter daily life truly felt to frontier families, because surviving accounts vary wildly. Some diaries suggest deep tedium, with repeated notes of weather, chores, and little else. Others hint at social visits, games, music, and shared reading when circumstances allowed. The truth likely depended on class, region, household size, literacy, weather severity, and sheer personality. Some people can make poetry out of a snow shovel, others cannot make peace with an afternoon indoors. Human variety does not vanish under wool. A quirky little detail appears in scattered recollections from rural winter life. Ice on the inside of windows or walls could sometimes be traced with fingers by children like a temporary drawing board. Frost feathers, stars, and fern-like patterns crept across surfaces overnight, turning bad insulation into accidental art. It is very frontier to admire beauty, while also resenting its source. Midday often comes without fanfare. The sky stays white or leaden. Light flattens the land, so fence lines and drifts merge into a soft confusion. Meals taken then are functional, perhaps bread and cold meat, perhaps leftovers, perhaps something warmed quickly before work resumes. You eat standing more often than comfort would recommend. There are animals to tend. Livestock in winter shape the day with non-negotiable authority. Feed must be carried, water checked, stalls mucked, Fences inspected where snowload or drift might conceal a weakness. The barn, shed, or lean-to has its own heavy atmosphere. Warm animal breath clouds the air. Hay smells dusty and sweet. Manure gives off that deep, sour, earthy scent that no one would bottle for pleasure, and yet becomes oddly reassuring in cold weather because it means life is still generating heat. Hooves shift on packed ground. A cow exhales like a tired bellows. Chickens mutter and scratch. You move among them with arms full, boots slick, face chilled, and clothes slowly gathering the perfume of practical survival. By afternoon, the body begins to tally its complaints. Back sore, hands rough, toes numb and then prickling, shoulders tired from lifting, eyes dry from smoke and wind, yet many tasks still wait. Corn may need shelling, meat may need slicing, candles may need trimming, grease saved, utensils scrubbed, a tool handle repaired, a child washed, snow beaten from blankets. The ordinary frontier day in winter is crowded with maintenance. Nothing dramatic, just the endless prevention of collapse. You become intimately aware of time by light and fuel. The lower the sun, the more urgent every unfinished task feels. Darkness on the frontier is not a gentle suggestion. It changes what can safely be done. Once the room depends on candle or firelight alone, work slows, eyes strain, and wasted motion grows expensive. So twilight has a quality of quiet pressure. The sky goes from pearl to grey to blue-black. Chimney smoke thickens. Distant trees lose detail. And inside each cabin, people race politely against the dark. Evening labour does not end simply because the door is barred. Supper must still be made. Wet things dried. Children settled. Tomorrow's materials arranged. A kettle set where it can heat early. Fire banked for the night with care, preserving embers under ash so morning does not begin from defeat. The room glows in flickering bands of orange and brown. Shadows tremble on the walls. The smell of food mixes with tallow, smoke, wool, and the faint cold draught that no amount of effort ever fully erases. This is also when the psychological side of daily routine reveals itself. Repetition can comfort, but it can also wear at the mind. The same path to the woodpile, the same bucket, the same frozen latch, the same stew pot, the same cough in the corner, the same wind feeling along the wall. Frontier people develop small ways to keep the spirit from hardening. A tune hummed while kneading dough. A joke told badly on purpose. A bit of gossip exchanged over a mending basket. A child reciting letters by firelight. Someone reading aloud from a Bible, almanac, or treasured book while others work with their hands. These moments do not erase hardship. They soften its edges enough to endure. You notice how sound behaves at night once the chores finally loosen their grip. Outside, snow absorbs and stills the world. Inside, every little noise becomes clearer. Spoon against bowl, fire settling, a chair creaking under tired weight, thread drawn through cloth, the wind at the chimney top, in a crowded cabin. Breathing itself becomes part of the room's texture. No orchestra, no sweeping frontier anthem, just the domestic music of people continuing. There is little privacy, but there can be companionship. There is little leisure, but there can be peace. You sit near the hearth with tired legs stretched toward the warmth and feel the heat on your shins while your shoulders remain cool. The wood smoke has worked itself into your hair. Your hands smell faintly of iron from the bucket handle and pine resin from the kindling. A patch in your sleeve scratches slightly where the seam was repaired. You're tired in a total way, not only in the muscles but in the mind. And still, there is satisfaction in a day where the fire stayed lit. The animals were fed, the water carried, the meal served, the night prepared for. That was daily life on the frontier in winter. Not one extraordinary crisis, though those could come. Not one heroic gesture, though courage was required. It was a discipline of ordinary persistence. A person survived by answering the same needs over and over, even when the answers were cold, heavy, or dull. The romance of wilderness fades quickly when you're scraping ice from a bucket in pre-dawn dark. What remains is something sturdier: habit, skill, restraint, the quiet pride of a household that made it through another day because no task was considered too small to matter. When you finally crawl into bed, the sheets are cold at first, the mattress rustles faintly, and the last light from the hearth throws a low red glow across the floor. Outside, snow lies over the yard, the path, the fields, the fences, making the whole world look hushed and harmless. You know better. Winter on the frontier is never harmless. But for this one night, the chores are done, the fire is banked, and the small cabin breathes around you like a tired creature that has survived another turn of the earth. By deep winter, warmth becomes the most persuasive thing in your life. It shapes where you stand, how you sit, what you fear, and what you forgive. A person with a reliable fire can seem wise, generous, even charming. A person who lets the hearth go cold acquires a different reputation very quickly. On the American frontier, heat was not background comfort. It was the centre around which winter existence arranged itself, minute by minute, log by log. You wake in darkness and reach first not for clothing, not for water, not for breakfast, but for signs of life in the hearth, there, under the grey ash. Something may still remain. A thread of red. A little pulse. A promise. You kneel close, your knees finding the hard floor by habit, and stir the ashes with a practised hand. Fine dust rises and catches in your throat. The smell is intimate now. Old charcoal, stale smoke, a faint mineral sharpness from yesterday's burned wood. Then a small glow brightens. You feed it shavings, then kindling, then a more serious stick. The flame catches with a dry whisper. This is not triumph. This is relief. One mainstream fact of frontier life is that keeping a fire alive through winter required constant attention. Many households banked the hearth each night, covering embers with ash so they would smoulder until morning. Starting a fresh fire from nothing was possible, of course, but it cost time, effort, tinder, and patience, all of which were in shorter supply before dawn. A surviving ember could feel like inheritance. The room changes almost immediately when flame returns. At first it is only visual. The dark wall behind the hearth begins to flicker. The iron pot takes on shape. A hanging ladle glints. Then the warmth begins to gather, not evenly, not generously, but enough to soften the bite in the air nearest the fire. Your face warms before your feet do. Your hands thaw while your shoulders stay tense. Heat in a frontier cabin is very particular. It reaches one patch of you and ignores another with complete confidence. So much of the day's labour feeds this single source of comfort. Wood first, always wood. You cannot speak about warmth on the frontier without speaking about the endless appetite of fire. A household could burn astonishing quantities through the cold season. More than newcomers expected, more than optimistic men estimated, more than aching backs wished to carry. Firewood had to be cut, split, hauled, stacked, sheltered, and brought in daily. The pile outside the cabin was never truly satisfying, because every glance at it also contained the image of it smaller. You walk to the wood stack through air so cold it feels polished. Snow squeaks beneath your boots. The logs are rough against your palms, bark flaking, edges sharp in places, damp in others. Some pieces smell resinous and bright when split, others darker and heavier. Oak, hickory, maple, pine, whatever the land has given, each burns differently. Hardwoods often provided longer, steadier heat with excellent coals. Softwoods caught more quickly and could spark or burn faster. Frontier people knew their wood in the practical way that hungry people know bread. Not sentimentally, precisely. Bring the wrong wood inside at the wrong time and the whole day acquires a tone. Greenwood hisses and smokes. Poorly seasoned logs sulk before catching. Wet pieces make a mockery of your effort and perfume the room with sour steam rather than heat. Good dry wood, by contrast, answers at once. It cracks cleanly under the axe. It lights with purpose. It gives off that deep, satisfying scent of warmed sap and clean combustion. There are few sounds more reassuring in winter than a solid log settling into a committed burn. Of course, Too much devotion to the fire introduced its own dangers. A frontier cabin could overheat nearest the hearth while remaining frigid elsewhere. More seriously, sparks could catch in dry cloth, bedding, or woodwork. Chimneys could foul, crack, or spit embers. Children had to be watched. Pots could tip. A sleeve could brush too near the flame. Warmth was necessary, but it demanded respect. Fire was both servant and tiny red tyrant. Historians still disagree over how warm frontier homes truly were in sustained cold, because memoirs and later retellings often lean either toward proud stoicism or exaggerated misery. The truth probably varied with region, fuel supply, construction quality, and household experience. Some cabins may have held a serviceable warmth near the hearth for much of the day. Others likely hovered in a state better described as survivable than comfortable. Human beings are also wildly adaptable. A room that would scandalize a modern visitor might have seemed reasonably managed to someone raised with winter drafts and smoky ceilings. You begin to notice that warmth has geography. Near the hearth, your shins grow hot, a step back and the air shifts abruptly. In the bed corner, under quilts and blankets, heat can be coaxed into a pocket around the body. Near the door, cold lurks like a patient creditor. Along the outer wall, the chill can settle into the wood and creep into anything hung there. A kettle suspended near the fire hums softly and sweats at the lip. A pair of mittens too close to the flame goes stiff, then nearly scorches. Every object in the room participates in the negotiation. Candles and lamps add another layer to this story. Not so much for warmth as for morale and utility. Tallow candles gave a dim, wavering light and their own distinct smell. Fatty, faintly sweet, slightly stale at times. Better candles burned cleaner but cost more. Oil lamps were useful where fuel could be had, though oil itself was another thing to secure. Lighting a room after sunset meant investing resources into continued wakefulness. You felt the cost in every inch of wick. So evening light tended to gather close around tasks, sewing near the candle, reading near the flame, faces emerging from shadow, then retreating again as someone moved. A quirky frontier detail appears in various recollections. People sometimes heated stones or bricks by the fire and wrapped them in cloth to warm beds or cold feet. Imagine the luxury of slipping under blankets with a little captured hearth already waiting near your toes. Imagine also the annoyance if the cloth failed or the stone cooled too soon. Still, it was a clever domestic trick, and frontier people loved anything that could turn limited heat into concentrated comfort. The body responds to fire in very direct, almost emotional ways. Cold tightens everything. Heat loosens it. Stiff fingers open. Shoulders drop. A face held tense outdoors begins to soften. Wet stockings steaming near the hearth release that unmistakable smell of damp wool and leather. Not attractive, but hopeful. Soup simmering over the flames adds another fragrance: salt, onions, beans, grease, grain. A whole household of smells woven together by warmth. The cabin becomes less hostile when something bubbles. Yet the fire never allows forgetfulness. It asks to be fed, adjusted, cleaned around, and guarded. Ash must be shoveled out, coals must be raked, pots must be turned, kindling must stay dry. Larger logs must be timed so they carry the household through cooking, mending, visiting, and finally the dark descent towards sleep. The best hearth managers developed a feel for flame the way a sailor develops a feel for wind. They knew when the fire wanted smaller wood, when it needed air, when a bed of coals would carry a kettle better than open flames, when it was about to collapse into wasteful laziness. Women often directed much of the day-to-day hearth labour because cooking and indoor work revolved around it, though men and children contributed constantly by cutting, hauling, splitting, and tending as needed. On the frontier, the idea that heat appeared through some mysterious domestic magic would have been laughed out of the cabin. Everyone knew the chain of labour behind a warm room. A fire represented trees felled months earlier, backs bent, hands scraped, time spent, weather endured. You feel that labour when you lift the iron crane or shift a pothook. The metal radiates heat in waves that sting before they comfort. A kettle lid rattles faintly. Grease pops. The hearthstones are warm under one knee, dusty under the other. Soot marks the edge of your cuff. Behind you someone turns a piece of clothing to dry. A child edges close enough to feel the warmth and is told, with practiced firmness, to edge back. Fire creates little zones of authority. Whoever manages it owns the centre of the room. Sometimes the weather still overpowers every effort. Wind drives smoke back down the chimney until the room fills with a bitter haze that makes eyes smart and throats tighten. Snow packed against a wall leaches cold inward. Fuel runs lower than planned. A trip to fetch more wood in blowing weather becomes miserable before it begins. On those days, warmth feels fragile, like carrying water in a woven basket. You keep working at it because there is no alternative worth discussing, and still, people found forms of comfort within these limits. Sitting near the hearth after supper while boots dry and a kettle sings softly can produce a kind of frontier luxury. Not abundance, not elegance. Just a moment when your hands stop aching and your body believes, briefly, that it has been forgiven. Someone shells beans by firelight. Someone pairs a piece of wood into a handle or peg. Someone hums. The flames paint the ceiling beams in amber. The rest of the room fades. It is enough. The contrast between light and dark sharpens every sensation. Outside, the night lies over the snow in blue-black stillness. Inside, the fire breathes gold and orange into the cabin's rough surfaces. Bark baskets throw crooked shadows. The table edge catches a line of glow. Steam from a wet coat rises in thin threads. Warmth has colour here. It has movement. It has a voice made of little snaps and murmurs. Scholarly uncertainty lingers around another question too. How often did frontier households supplement hearth heat with braziers, stoves, or other devices in different regions and periods? The answer is not simple. Cast iron stoves became more available over time and transformed domestic heating, where families could acquire them. But in many places and earlier periods, the open hearth remained central. Records survive unevenly, and equipment varied by wealth, trade access, and date. What is clear is that any improvement in heating technology was cherished, because winter had a way of making innovation seem morally excellent. Stoves, where present, changed the emotional landscape of a room. They could provide steadier heat and use fuel more efficiently, though they also required care and proper venting. A warm stovetop could dry mittens, heat water, or support cooking with enviable practicality. People living with one might still complain naturally. Complaining is one of humanity's most renewable resources, but compared with a smoky, ravenous hearth, an efficient stove could look like civilization arriving in iron. Even so, most frontier warmth remained intimate and local. A shawl around the shoulders, a child tucked under quilts, a dog curled near the fire, hands extended over embers, hot broth in a mug, warm stones in the bed, a cat claiming the best place with complete moral certainty. Heat was experienced in pockets, patches, and moments. You learned not to demand more than the room could give. Gratitude becomes easier when expectations have been educated by January. There is also the strange psychology of light from fire alone. Candlelight is delicate, daylight is honest. Firelight flatters, it smooths rough boards, softens tired faces, and turns plain food into something almost ceremonial. The cabin may be cramped, smoky, and patched, but under evening flames it gains dignity. The same battered spoon, the same scarred table, the same soot-dark rafters now look as though they belong to a life being held together with intention rather than exhaustion. That is not illusion exactly. It is perspective warmed. Late at night, after the last chores, the hearth returns to strategy. Large pieces are positioned, ashes drawn over the glowing bed. The room cools as people settle into blankets. The final smell is a mingling of dying flame, wool, and sleeping bodies, somewhere outside. Wind moves over the roof with a low, dry sound. Somewhere inside, a log gives one last muted crack. You lie there knowing the morning will begin again with the search for embers, That was the frontier lesson about heat. Warmth was never a passive blessing that floated down over the household. It was built, fed, guarded, and rationed. It filled your hands with splinters and your sleeves with ash. It asked for trees, labour, attention, and caution. Yet for all that effort, it offered something greater than mere comfort. It made a small rough cabin inhabitable in the dead of winter. It turned food into supper, darkness into evening, and a house full of cold people into a household. When you finally close your eyes, your face still remembers the fire's glow. Your feet search out the little pocket of retained warmth beneath the blankets. Beyond them waits the deep frontier cold, patient as ever. But here, within rough walls and near a banked bed of coals, you possess the most valuable thing winter ever allowed. Not safety exactly, something humbler and perhaps more precious. A circle of heat, held for one more night. Cold weather has a way of finding every weakness in the body and then sitting on it. A cough that would seem minor in autumn grows heavier in winter. A cracked finger becomes a constant misery when water, wind, and rough work keep reopening it. A sore throat feels more ominous when the nearest doctor is far away. The roads are poor, and the snow is not in a helpful mood. On the American frontier, illness in winter was not only about symptoms, it was about distance, delay, and the simple fact that a sick person still lived inside a household that had to keep working. You notice it first in the quiet changes. Someone speaks less at breakfast. Someone leaves half a bowl untouched. A child who usually fidgets by the fire sits too still and leans against a quilt with unusual patience. A man returning from the woodpile wipes his nose, then coughs once into his sleeve and says it is nothing. That phrase, as history repeatedly confirms, is rarely encouraging. The cabin itself can become both refuge and hazard for the ill. It offers shelter from wind and snow. Yes, and the hearth gives warmth, hot water, and a place to watch over a patient through the long dark. But the room is also crowded, smoky, and rarely clean by modern standards. Air does not circulate kindly. Bedding holds coughs, sweat, and dampness. Shared utensils, close quarters, and constant contact mean a sickness can move through a household with rude efficiency. Winter locks people together. Germs appreciate cooperation. A mainstream truth of frontier life is that medical help could be limited, expensive, or entirely absent. Some settlements had physicians within reach. Others relied on midwives, experienced neighbours, herbal knowledge, family remedies, and plain hope. A doctor might need hours or longer as to arrive, assuming weather allowed travel at all. Roads vanished under snow, rivers iced over unpredictably, horses tired, and messages travelled slowly. A person could worsen a great deal while waiting for professional care that might never appear. So the first line of defence was usually the household itself. Warmth mattered. Rest mattered. Fluids mattered, even if those words were not always framed in modern medical language. Broths, teas, heated drinks, poultices, blankets, and careful watching formed the rhythm of care. You heat water in an iron kettle until steam breathes into the room. The smell of herbs rises from a mug, perhaps mint, sassafras, horehound, or whatever local or household tradition favours. Cloths warmed near the hearth are folded and placed against aching chests or stiff joints. Blankets are tucked close, then loosened, then tucked again as fever shifts. Touch becomes part of the diagnosis. A hand on the forehead, fingers at the wrist, a palm against the cheek. Skin speaks, hot, dry, clammy, cold, burning. All of it gives clues. A mother, sister, wife, or neighbour. Often read those signs through experience rather than formal training. Frontier nursing was intimate, practical, and exhausting. It meant sitting up in broken sleep, carrying water, changing bedding, cooling a fevered face, coaxing sips of broth, and listening in the dark for breathing that sounded too shallow, too quick, or too strange. The sounds of sickness alter the cabin at once. Coughing in the night has a different weight from conversation. A wheeze can fill the room more completely than a shout. The scrape of a chair drawn close to a bedside, the clink of spoon against cup, the hiss of a kettle, the pop of the fire while everyone listens between pops for the next breath. Illness rearranges attention. Even ordinary chores are done with one ear turned toward the bed. Fever had its own frightening theatre, a face flushed bright in the firelight, eyes too shiny, hair damp at the temples, blankets thrown off, then clutched back a few minutes later as chills take hold. The room smells of sweat, tallow, hot cloth, and smoke. The patient may drift in and out, mumbling or restless. You sit nearby with your own shoulders tight from fatigue, and from the knowledge that you cannot command the body back into health just because the weather is offensive. Respiratory illness was one of winter's most common threats. Colds, influenza, pneumonia, bronchitis, and other infections could move from nuisance to danger with alarming speed. A simple cough in deep cold could deepen into something harsher, especially in cabins where smoke irritated the lungs and nutrition was uneven. Children and older adults were especially vulnerable. So were people already weakened by poor diet, hard labour, childbirth, or previous illness. Winter did not invent frailty, but it certainly knew how to exploit it. Then there were injuries particular to cold itself. Frostnip and frostbite could strike fingers, toes, ears, or nose after hard travel or chores in severe weather. At first the skin turns pale or numb. Then comes pain, or sometimes the eerie absence of it. A hand brought too quickly toward great heat after freezing may throb with astonishing intensity. Frontier people learned caution from experience, though experience was not always kind enough to leave all fingers fully useful afterward. Cracked skin, chilblains, and inflamed hands from repeated cold exposure were common miseries too. None of them sound grand. All of them make daily labour more difficult. You hold out rough hands toward the fire and examine the knuckles. The skin is split in narrow lines, reddened at the joints, sore when flexed. Lye soap, cold water, harsh air, and work with wood or rope have left their signatures. A little grease or salve rubbed in at night can help, if there is enough to spare. Tallow, beeswax mixtures, herbal ointments, even plain animal fat might serve. The relief is modest, but modest relief counts. Scholars still debate how effective many frontier home remedies truly were in practice, because records blend observation, tradition, superstition, and later memory in uneven ways. Some treatments clearly offered comfort or practical support. Others may have done little. A few could be harmful, yet it would be unfair to dismiss household medicine as mere folklore. In settings where professional care was scarce, generations of people built systems of trial, error, and local knowledge. They were often doing the best they could with what was at hand, which is a very old human profession. A quirky detail from older winter care is the use of onion poultices, mustard plasters, goose grease rubs, or camphor-based applications to ease chest complaints. Whether they cured much is open to debate, but they certainly announced themselves. The smell alone could occupy a room. Mustard in particular had a sharp, hot scent and a sting on the skin that made the whole procedure feel wonderfully decisive. Human beings do love remedies that seem to be doing something. Toothache was another small frontier nightmare. Winter did not cause it, of course, but cold air could sharpen it into misery, and access to dental care was even rarer than access to physicians. A bad tooth could disrupt sleep, appetite, and temper for days. Clove, spirits, herbal rinses, or simple endurance might be all that stood between a person and total irritability. The frontier was full of brave souls brought low by one rebellious molar. Women faced additional dangers when pregnancy or childbirth collided with winter. A birth in severe weather meant warmth had to be maintained, water heated, linens prepared, and help summoned if possible across snow and darkness. Midwives and experienced female neighbours were often the true medical infrastructure of rural communities. Their knowledge was practical, embodied, and indispensable. Yet even with skilled hands present, complications could become deadly fast. The cabin that held ordinary domestic life by day might become a place of intense vigilance and whispered urgency by night. You become aware, too, of the emotional toll of caring for the sick. The work is repetitive and heavy in its own quiet way. Lift the cup, change the cloth, check the fire, listen, wait, doze in a chair, and wake with a stiff neck. Step outside briefly and feel the shocking purity of the cold air, then return to the warm, close, sour smell of illness inside. Fatigue blurs time. One long night can feel like 3. A caretaker may end up ill as well, because winter is generous with burdens and stingy with rest. Not every winter ailment was dramatic. There were headaches from smoke and bad light, stomach complaints from spoiled food or contaminated water, rheumatic pain worsened by cold damp, exhaustion that settled into the bones after weeks of hard labour and poor sleep, melancholy too. Though frontier people might not label it as later generations would, a person could grow quiet, heavy, and withdrawn under the weight of darkness, isolation, and unending chores. The body and spirit were never truly separate in these settings, no matter how neatly people wished to think of them. One of the more unsettling features of winter illness is that the healthy must continue. Firewood still needs cutting, animals still need feed, water still must be brought in, bread still must be made. So a sick household often becomes a strained household, where labour shifts onto fewer shoulders. Children may take on extra work. Neighbours may appear to help, if roads and generosity allow. Without that help, recovery becomes harder simply because survival tasks do not pause for fever. This is where community sometimes made the difference between worry and disaster. A nearby woman may bring broth or sit with a patient while another person sleeps. A man might haul wood for a sick family or fetch the doctor if one can be found. Someone lends dried herbs, whiskey, blankets, or a horse. These gestures are practical, not sentimental. They smell of snow on coats, horse sweat, cold leather, and the familiar smoke of another household. Frontier kindness often arrived carrying something useful. The patient bed becomes its own tiny world, sheets or blankets rumpled and warmed by hours of sickness, a mug on a stool nearby, a basin set within reach, candlelight soft on the wall, a Bible, almanac, or scrap of cloth lying forgotten where a hand last dropped it. The air there feels warmer, thicker, more watched than the rest of the room. Every shift in breathing changes the atmosphere. When the fever breaks, even a little, the relief is almost physical in everyone nearby. The whole cabin seems to loosen its shoulders, and when it does not break, fear grows quiet and efficient. People on the frontier were no strangers to death, but that did not make it simple. Winter funerals brought practical difficulties of frozen ground, delayed travel, and the burden of grief inside an already strained season. Yet many illnesses resolved, slowly, imperfectly, with the body clawing its way back through rest, warmth, and time. Recovery was rarely glamorous. A patient rose weak, thin, irritable, and hungry. Coughs lingered. Strength returned slowly. But even that slow return felt like spring arriving inside one person. You see the signs in reverse. A bowl finished. A clearer voice. Colour restored to the mouth. Better sleep. The patient sitting up near the fire, wrapped in a blanket, looking fragile but present again. Recovery has its own smell too. Less fever, more broth, more clean air let in briefly through the door, more ordinary life creeping back around the edges. That ordinariness matters. Someone complains about the draft again. Someone argues mildly over how much wood to bring in. A child laughs too loudly. The kettle begins its usual mutter. These tiny annoyances become reassuring because they mean the household is no longer entirely organised around one bed and one pair of lungs. Winter illness on the frontier revealed a harsh truth. Survival depended not just on strength, but on care. Not just on the person swinging the axe, but on the one sitting through the night with a damp cloth and a spoonful of broth. A cabin could be sturdy, provisions decent, fire well tended, and still be humbled by a fever. That uncertainty lay over the season like another layer of frost. No one could work enough to banish it completely. So when you settle near the hearth late in the evening and hear only the ordinary sounds of the room, fire, spoon, low voices, boots drying, the faint stir of bedding, you recognise the gift in that plainness. Health on the frontier was rarely a shining state of perfection. It was often something humbler, the ability to rise, carry, chop, bend, eat, breathe deeply, and sleep without alarm. Winter taught people to value those common powers with unusual seriousness, and in the close candlelit air of the cabin, with the cold pressing at the walls and the patient finally resting easier, you understand why sickness felt so frightening in this world. It did not arrive alone. It brought delay, labour, doubt, and the weather itself into the room. Yet you also see what stood against it. Warm hands, watchful eyes, hard-won household knowledge, the will to keep tending the fire and the body beside it, hour after hour, until morning gave some answer. The loneliness of frontier winter does not always arrive as sadness. Sometimes it arrives as distance made visible. You step outside at dawn and see smoke from another cabin far away, a thin grey thread over white land, and the sight feels both comforting and absurd. There are people out there. Of course there are. Yet the space between you and them is full of snow, cold, trees, uneven ground, and the thousand little delays that turn a visit into an undertaking. On the American frontier, neighbours could be close enough to matter deeply and far enough away to feel almost imaginary on certain days. This is one of winter's stranger tricks. The season pulls households inward, wrapping each one around its own fire, food, and chores. A cabin becomes a world unto itself. The same voices, the same footsteps, the same scraping chair, swinging door, coughing child, kettle song, and evening sigh. Familiarity grows dense. Then, all at once, you crave another voice, another face, another pair of boots stamping snow from the threshold. Human beings are apparently not designed to thrive forever in a two-room republic of smoke and turnips. In warmer months, visiting can happen almost casually. Paths are visible, creeks are passable, wagons move, news travels with less effort. Winter complicates everything. Snow covers ruts, dips, roots, and stones. Ice makes even a short walk uncertain. Wind can wipe out tracks and turn open ground into a cold, broad warning. A mile becomes longer when every step asks a question. 2 miles can feel like an expedition. 5 may as well be diplomacy. Still, people went, one mainstream truth of frontier life is that survival often depended on neighbourly exchange as much as on private household effort. A family might borrow tools, share labour, swap food, trade seed, help with illness, assist at births, join in butchering, or carry messages over difficult ground. Isolation is part of the frontier image, but complete isolation was rarely sustainable for long. Even fiercely independent settlers often relied on webs of mutual aid, whether they admitted it cheerfully or with the expression of someone lending a bucket while pretending not to. You set out across a narrow path pressed into the snow by earlier footsteps. The air is still enough that your own breathing sounds louder than expected. Wool scratches faintly at your neck. The cold touches your face with a dry, clean firmness. Somewhere in the trees a branch cracks under frost. Your boots make a steady crunch, and after a while, the sound becomes its own companion. The land in winter seems simplified at first glance. White field, dark trees, pale sky. But as you move through it, details return. Rabbit tracks crossing the path, a fence nearly swallowed by drift, a frozen creek shining through bare branches, smoke rising where a cabin must stand beyond the ridge. When you finally reach another house, the welcome begins before words do. The door opens. Warmth touches your face. The smell meets you first. Wood smoke, cooking, damp coats, maybe hay clinging to someone's clothes, maybe the sweetness of something baking if fortune has become unusually generous. Then come voices, sudden and human in the close room. A chair is offered. Gloves are pulled off stiffly. Snow melts from your boots onto the floor. The ordinary noise of another household can feel almost festive. Conversation matters more in winter because information does. News is never merely gossip when distance and weather rule daily life. Has the river frozen solid enough for crossing? Did someone lose a cow? Is a peddler expected when roads improve? Who is sick? Who needs help? Which family has meal to spare? Whether wolves were heard near the ridge? If a preacher, doctor, or trader has been seen? Whether a storm seems to be building from the west? All these bits of talk travel mouth to mouth, cabin to cabin, as if the settlement itself thinks through scattered voices. Yet winter visiting is not only practical, it is emotional fuel. You notice how faces animate in company. Even tired people sit straighter when guests arrive. Children brighten, adults become more talkative, or at least more varied in their complaints. A joke gets told, someone laughs more loudly than necessary, which is a sign not of poor manners but of stored-up loneliness escaping all at once. Historians still argue over how socially rich frontier winters truly were, because surviving accounts differ according to region, ethnicity, religion, class, and family temperament. Some descriptions emphasize long isolation, dangerous roads, and infrequent contact. Others suggest a lively culture of evening visits, quilting gatherings, corn huskings in season, singing, shared meals, and neighbourhood labour. The truth may lie in the unevenness. A harsh week could cut everyone off. A calmer spell might suddenly bring a cluster of social calls, as if people rushed to use the weather while it permitted civilization. A quirky detail from some rural accounts is that visitors were often recognised long before they reached the cabin by the sound of sleigh bells, dogs barking, or the distinct rhythm of steps outside. In deep snow, sound carries oddly, and a household might begin guessing the caller from gait, voice, or horse long before the latch lifted. A frontier driveway was not required. The snow announced people well enough. You also learn that hospitality on the frontier was part kindness, part expectation, and part necessity. A traveller in winter could not always be turned away without moral discomfort. Conditions were too harsh, the distances too large, the roads too uncertain. So an extra bowl might be filled, a place by the fire offered, a blanket spread, even by households not overflowing with resources. This generosity was real, but it was not romantic nonsense. People understood that the same mercy shown today might be needed tomorrow in reverse. Inside a winter cabin with company, every sensation sharpens pleasantly. The room feels smaller but warmer. Tallow candles throw more animated light across faces. Mugs pass from hand to hand. The smell of wet wool drying by the hearth mingles with supper and smoke. Someone shifts a stool to make room. Someone peels off a scarf and rubs cold hands together. The talk moves in waves. Practical matters first, then family news, then stories that grow a little better with each telling. Frontier humour often had a dry edge, because when life gives you snow, smoke, and shortages, cheerfulness needs reinforcement. Children listened closely on such evenings, not always because they were invited into adult talk, but because company disrupted routine in the most delightful way. New voices, new stories, a different laugh, a different pair of boots by the door, perhaps even a treat or some little object produced from a pocket. A child on the frontier learned early that visitors enlarged the world. They brought fresh details from beyond the fields, beyond the creek, beyond the daily orbit of chores. They proved other lives continued out there in the cold. For adults, social contact could be just as sustaining, though expressed less theatrically. A woman seeing another woman after a stretch of household confinement might exchange news, recipes, remedies, sewing patterns, birth stories, worries, and the sort of practical observations that hold a community together more firmly than speeches ever could. Men might discuss land, fencing, weather, politics, livestock, timber, tools, and the complicated diplomacy of borrowing. None of this was trivial. Social knowledge on the frontier was infrastructure. Religion often strengthened these ties. In places where a church or meeting house existed within reach, winter attendance depended heavily on weather and road conditions, but faith gatherings still served as major points of contact, where no formal building stood nearby. Prayers or readings in homes might gather neighbours in smaller circles. Such meetings offered worship, certainly, but also recognition. To be seen, greeted, and spoken to by others in winter was itself a kind of reassurance. Then there were the darker currents of community life. Not all neighbourly contact was cosy. Old disputes over property lines, stray animals, debts, courtship, doctrine, or simple personality could smoulder more fiercely when households were strained. Winter did not magically transform difficult people into angels by the fire. A neighbour might be generous one day and maddening the next. Shared survival encouraged cooperation, but it did not abolish pride. In fact, close dependence could make conflicts more awkward. It is hard to stay nobly offended when you may soon need to borrow a shovel. You feel that tension sometimes in conversations where politeness sits very straight. A man remarks on another's firewood supply with too much interest. A woman asks whether flour is holding out in a tone that sounds helpful and slightly investigative. Someone mentions a boundary marker buried under snow. Someone else changes the subject with heroic speed. Frontier society was intimate enough that everyone mattered, and small enough that everyone noticed. The physical challenge of reaching neighbours added seriousness to every social choice. If you visited, it was for a reason, even when the reason was simply not wanting to feel trapped within your own walls. Travel after dark could be risky unless the route was known well. Storms could rise, ice could betray a horse or foot traveller, so visits often carried a little tension in them from the start. You enjoyed company while already half calculating the return. That awareness made gatherings feel more precious. A few homes became natural centres of neighbourhood life. Perhaps they were better built, larger, more centrally located, or occupied by especially sociable people. Perhaps a midwife lived there, or a family known for music, or simply a couple with enough room to host without complete chaos. Human geography forms quickly in hard conditions. Some doorways draw people, others repel them. A warm hearth and decent conversation can be as powerful as any map. Music had its place in these winters too. A fiddle, a hymn sung together, a ballad remembered in pieces, children chanting a rhyme. Such sounds could fill a cabin with something larger than the room itself. The tune might be imperfect, the rhythm might drift. Nobody cared much. The pleasure lay partly in the music and partly in the shared act of making it. Outside stretched miles of dark land and cold silence. Inside, a human voice rose and did not have to stand alone. Scholarly uncertainty lingers around how much social life was shaped by particular ethnic traditions in different frontier regions, because records often flatten distinct communities into a single broad pioneer story. In reality, German, Scots-Irish, English, French, African-American, Hispanic, and many other groups carried their own customs of visiting, hospitality, worship, music, and winter celebration into frontier settings. Indigenous communities, too, had their own rich social structures and seasonal rhythms, often intersecting with settler worlds in complex ways. The frontier was never one culture with one accent and one stew recipe. However much later stories tried to simplify it, you come to appreciate the small ritual of departure as much as arrival. Cloaks and coats are gathered, boots pulled on near the fire, hands are shaken. Food may be tucked into a pocket or bundle if need is evident and pride can bear it. The door opens to a blade of cold. Breath turns white at once. The sky outside may be black and thick with stars, or grey with gathering weather. Voices drop a little softer at the threshold. Travel safe. Come again when the road allows. Tell them what you heard. Bring word if the doctor passes. Human connection on the frontier often ended with instructions. Then the quiet returns. After guests leave, the cabin feels larger and smaller at the same time. Larger because the extra-bodied voices and steam have gone. Smaller because you feel their absence immediately. The stools are back in place, the mugs are empty. The dog circles and lies down again. The fire settles into its usual language. Yet something lingers, a loosened mood, a fuller sense of belonging to a living settlement rather than a solitary struggle. Even a brief visit can carry a household for days, and when no visit comes for a long while, loneliness takes on a texture of its own. It is not always dramatic grief. Often it is a dullness in the hours, a feeling that the world has narrowed to chores and familiar faces, however loved those faces may be. The same landscape outside, the same rooms, the same stories already told. In such times, the sight of distant smoke or a lone figure on the path can strike the heart with absurd force. Company becomes visible before it becomes audible. That is what neighbours meant in winter on the American frontier. Not constant companionship, not easy access, not a village lane with cheerful doors side by side, something more deliberate and perhaps more meaningful. A scattered network of households bound by need, weather, courtesy, memory, and the understanding that no fire burned entirely on its own. Miles could separate people, snow could silence roads, pride could complicate kindness. Yet when the latch lifted and another human stepped in from the cold, carrying news, help, or simply their presence, the whole season seemed less immense. You sit by the hearth after such a visit and listen to the night settle around the cabin. The wind moves faintly at the eaves, the room smells of smoke, damp wool, and the last of the evening meal. Somewhere beyond the dark fields, other cabins hold other fires and other tired people finishing their own chores. You cannot see them now. You do not need to. Winter's taught you the value of knowing they are there. Snow is a ruthless storyteller. It records everything that crosses the yard while you sleep, then presents the evidence at first light with no concern for your nerves. You open the door, and the world looks untouched for one calm second. Then your eye adjusts. There, a line of rabbit print stitching toward the woodpile. There, the delicate paired marks of a squirrel. There, the sharper, more deliberate trail of a fox angling past the chicken shelter as if conducting business. And there, if fortune wishes to wake you quickly, tracks large enough to make you stop breathing for a moment before the cold takes over and reminds you to continue. Winter brought animals closer to human settlement on the American frontier in ways that could feel practical, eerie, or deeply inconvenient. Wild creatures followed hunger, domestic animals tested fences, weakened under strain, or attracted predators by their very existence. The line between household and wilderness was never absolute, but snow made that truth obvious. A cabin was not a sealed world. It was a warm interruption in a landscape full of moving lives. You learn to read the ground almost as carefully as you read the pantry. Tracks near the outbuildings mean more than curiosity. They are information. Deer might suggest a chance for meat. Rabbit tracks can mean snares set with hope. Fox prints near the henhouse mean vigilance. A dog's wandering pattern may reveal where a board is loose or a gate failed to latch. Every mark in the snow has a practical meaning waiting behind it. Winter writes in a language of feet, claws, and hooves. One mainstream fact of frontier survival is that livestock often stood at the centre of a family's winter security. Cows provided milk when feed and health allowed. Oxen and horses meant work, transport, and power. Hogs represented meat and lard. Chickens offered eggs when conditions were favourable and feed sufficient. Sheep brought wool and, depending on the household, future meat. Losing an animal in winter was not merely sad. It could cut straight into food supply, labour capacity, and spring recovery all at once. So the daily care of animals carries a seriousness that borders on reverence. You step into the barn or lean-to and the air changes at once. Outside is sharp, clean cold. Inside is damp warmth, hay dust, breath, manure, and the thick animal smell that settles into wool sleeves and hair. Hooves scrape. A cow shifts her weight with a low grunt. Chickens rustle and mutter in their corner. A horse turns its head and exhales a long cloud into the dim light. The place is messy, imperfect, and deeply alive. Feed becomes the winter measure of mercy. Hay has to last. Grain must be used with thought. Water must be checked and freed from ice. Animals burn energy keeping themselves warm. And if the feed runs short, their ribs begin to tell on them. You run a hand along a cow's side and feel the shape more sharply than you would like. Her hide is cool, her breath warm and grassy, her eye patient. Frontier people often spoke of stock in matter-of-fact terms, but there was emotion under that tone. You do not share daily hardship with an animal for months without feeling the bond, even if necessity later demands hard choices. The horse or ox, especially, could become an object of intense household attention in bad weather. Without a sound animal to haul wood, carry a rider, pull a sled, or fetch help, winter grew narrower and more dangerous. A lame horse meant slower travel. A dead ox could cripple work plans for seasons. Even a minor injury had consequences. A cracked hoof, a pulled muscle, a cough. These were not little inconveniences in a world where muscle power often meant survival. Scholars still debate how heavily frontier families relied on hunting for winter meat in different places and periods, because memories and later legend often exaggerate the woods as an endless pantry. In reality, success depended on game populations, skill, weather, ammunition, territory, and simple luck. Some families supplemented their diet meaningfully with deer, rabbit, squirrel, turkey, or other game. Others found the winter woods much less generous than stories suggest. Snow could help reveal tracks, but it also made travel harder, and hunting failures more costly. You feel the logic of that trade the moment you leave shelter to follow a trail. Snow underfoot gives with a muffled crunch. Bare branches click faintly in the breeze. The cold has a taste almost like iron in the back of your throat. You pause, listening. Somewhere far off, a crow complains. Nearby, the woods hold that winter hush that is never quite silence. A snapped twig sounds louder than it has any right to. Your mitten brushes rough bark. Your nose runs in the cold. Hunting in such weather is less like adventure and more like patient negotiation with discomfort. Still, wild animals did provide opportunity. Rabbit and squirrel could be taken with traps or small arms, and made into stews that felt doubly welcome for having broken the monotony of stored food. Deer meant real value, meat, hide, bone, sinew, tallow. Nothing was wasted casually where winter had educated people properly. A successful hunt could improve both the pantry and the household mood at once. Even the smell of fresh meat in the cabin changed the atmosphere. It cut through the older odours of smoke, wool, and dried provisions with a richer promise. Not all animal encounters were welcome. Predators had their own winter arithmetic. Foxes circled poultry. Wildcats or bobcats in some regions threatened smaller stock. Wolves, in places where they remained common, haunted the frontier imagination with particular force. The actual danger wolves posed to people varied by circumstance, and was often amplified in fearful retelling, but their threat to livestock was real enough to keep households alert. A howl in the night could travel across frozen ground in a way that made the dark feel broader than before. A quirky detail from frontier life is how often ordinary dogs became crucial partners in the winter animal world. A good dog warned of visitors, tracked movement, guarded stock, accompanied hunts, and sounded alarm at strange noises near the yard. A poor dog, naturally, barked at snowflakes and then slept through actual trouble. Human civilization has always included both kinds. The right dog could be treasured beyond its practical use, simply because it added a layer of vigilance no one else could maintain while half asleep. You begin to notice the signs of animal stress in winter. Chickens stop laying regularly. A cow drinks less or stands dull and still. A horse's coat grows rough and heavy, useful for warmth, but also a reminder of the season's wear. Pigs, if still being kept, root grumpily in confined spaces and convert feed into complaint with their usual talent. Domestic animals do not romanticize winter either. They endure it because they must. The sounds around the yard become important clues. An unusual crash in the night may mean a loose board, a fallen gate, or an animal panicking. Hens can produce a tone of alarm distinct from their usual busy nonsense. A horse kicking the stall wall sends a jolt through the household. Dogs barking toward the tree line raise every head by the fire. Frontier sleep was often lighter than comfort would advise, partly because people learned to listen through walls. The yard could change shape in a single dark hour. When trouble comes, it often begins small, a track where none should be, a gap under the fence drifted wider by wind, a hen missing, a calf looking weaker than yesterday, frost gathering thick on an animal's muzzle after a hard night. You move through these signs with a mix of worry and routine. Feed first, check the latch, examine the prints, bring in more bedding straw, reset the snare, repair the board. Nothing dramatic, at least not yet. But winter teaches you that large losses are often assembled from ignored little warnings. There is also the simple physical challenge of handling animals in cold. Rope stiffens, fingers lose dexterity. Metal bits, buckles, or latches sting the skin through thin gloves. A cow does not become easier to milk because the pail rim is icy and your hands ache. A horse does not cooperate more sweetly because your boots are numb. The body works slower in cold, while the animals remain exactly as demanding as before. It is one of winter's less generous jokes. Some households depended partly on trapping for furs as well as food. Beaver, muskrat, fox, raccoon, and other animals could represent trade value depending on region and era. The fur trade shaped huge parts of North American frontier life, though its local importance varied. For certain men and communities, winter trapping was not a side task, but a major economic activity. Yet it was hard work carried through frozen marshes, river edges, and wooded ground that offered plenty of misery along with profit. Romance later improved the lighting considerably. Historians still argue about how much frontier fear of wild animals was shaped by actual risk versus cultural memory carried from older worlds. European settlers brought stories and assumptions about wolves, bears, and wilderness danger that did not always match local patterns neatly. Indigenous knowledge of animal behaviour often provided a more precise understanding, though settlers did not always listen as well as they should have. Fear on the frontier was rarely invented from nothing, but it was often embroidered. Bears, where present, complicated winter in their own way. A bear not denned properly, or drawn by food near settlement, could alarm a household thoroughly. More often, however, the winter concerns were the smaller, more constant forms of pressure. Foxes near hens, wolves near livestock in certain regions, rodents in stored feed, stray dogs causing trouble, weakened stock failing under cold and hunger. Daily danger is usually less theatrical than legend, also more annoying. The sensory world of the barn at dusk can feel almost soothing despite all this tension. Hay scratches softly against your wrist. A lantern throws weak yellow light over boards darkened by years of use. Warm animal breath fogs and disappears. The smell is thick, sweet, sour, earthy, and familiar. Outside, snow reflects the last grey of the sky. Inside, chewing continues with a calm, steady rhythm that quiets the mind. There is comfort in creatures that must be fed every day, because they leave so little room for useless fretting. The cow does not care about your abstract worries. She wants hay, and yet, animals could also bring companionship that softened the frontier's harder edges. A dog at the hearth, a cat patrolling for mice, a horse that nickers when you enter. These presences mattered in ways beyond utility. The frontier household was not purely human, and winter made that especially clear. Warm fur against your hand, the purr of a cat near the coals, the sleepy shifting of livestock under a roof, all of it reminded you that survival was shared across species, though not always equally. By night, the tracks outside vanish under fresh powder or freeze into harder edges by moonlight. The tree line becomes a black wall. Somewhere beyond it, animals continue their own winter business, hunting, hiding, breeding, starving, enduring. The frontier cabin does not sit apart from that world so much as push back against it with fences, fire, and habit. Every hen secured, every cow watered, every track noticed, every board repaired. These are little acts of boundary making. That boundary never holds perfectly. A mouse slips into the grain. A fox tests the coop. A deer crosses the yard, bold with hunger. The dog stiffens and growls at something unseen. You wake, listen, and understand again that the American frontier in winter was never empty land around a lonely house. It was active land, marked and watched by creatures with needs of their own. The snow made them visible, but it did not create them. They were always there, near the edges of your chores, your meals, your sleep. So when morning comes and you step out into the pale light to inspect the ground, you're doing more than checking for trouble. You are reading the night's negotiations. Here is where the household held. Here is where the wild pressed close. Here is where hunger passed by. Here is where opportunity might be followed into the trees. Every print is a little reminder that frontier winter was not only cold and isolation. It was a constant conversation with animals, domestic and wild, each one shaping the terms of survival, and standing there with the door at your back, smoke rising above the roof, and the snow spread wide before you like a page already written on. You understand why people learn to look down so carefully in winter. The ground itself was talking. On the frontier, it paid to listen. By late winter, endurance is no longer only a matter of food, fuel, and weather. It becomes a matter of what you tell yourself while the wind leans against the cabin and the days still seem too short for all that must be done. The body can survive on bread, beans, and stubbornness for a surprisingly long time. The spirit is fussier. It wants meaning, it wants patterns, it wants some assurance that the season is not simply a white tunnel with no exit. On the American frontier, people met that need with prayer, folklore, ritual, habit, and humour so dry it could have been stacked with the firewood. You feel it most strongly at night. The chores are done as well as they can be. The fire has settled into a steady glow. The room smells of smoke, warm cloth, tallow, and the last traces of supper. Outside, darkness presses against the window and the door with complete confidence. This is when the mind begins to wander if left unattended. It counts shortages. It imagines storms. It replays old worries in a slower, gloomier voice. So people found ways to answer the dark. Religion stood close to the centre of that answer for many frontier households. Prayer was not always grand or theatrical. Often it was simple, repeated, practical. A blessing over food, a psalm read by candlelight, a few lines spoken before sleep while boots dried by the hearth. In some homes, Scripture was the most important book present, read not only for doctrine but for rhythm, familiarity, and company. The language itself could steady people. Words repeated across nights and winters became almost architectural. They helped hold the room together. One mainstream historical fact is that religious practice on the frontier was often household-based as much as church-based, especially in isolated areas where formal worship might be irregular. Ministers were not always nearby. Roads were bad. Distances were long. Meeting houses might be small, temporary, or absent altogether. So many families carried devotion into ordinary domestic routines. The cabin table, the bedside, and the hearth all served as places where belief was spoken aloud. Prayer also had a social function. It made fear orderly. When a child was sick, when food ran low, when weather turned vicious, prayer gave people language for uncertainty. It did not always remove fear. It arranged it. That matters more than modern impatience likes to admit. A person kneeling by the fire with clasped hands and tired eyes was not necessarily expecting instant rescue from the sky. Sometimes that person was simply refusing to let dread speak the loudest. The sounds of evening devotion can be very gentle. A Bible page turning with a dry whisper. A voice reading slowly, shaped by fatigue and habit. Another voice joining in for a hymn, uncertain at first, then firmer. The cabin grows quieter around such sounds. Even children often feel the mood change. Fire pops once. Wind moves at the chimney. The words continue. In that moment, the household has created a small circle of order inside a world that remains cold and unconvinced. Yet frontier belief was never only official religion. Folklore lived beside it, sometimes peacefully, sometimes with raised eyebrows. People watched signs in weather, dreams, animals, and household accidents with more attention than they would perhaps admit in daylight. A ring around the moon, the cry of a particular bird, the way the fire snapped, the sudden behaviour of dogs, strange knocks in the night, all could invite interpretation. Winter encourages this kind of thinking. Long dark evenings make symbols out of ordinary things. Scholars still debate how deeply such beliefs shaped actual frontier decisions, because people often left stronger written records of formal religion than of private superstition. A diary may note prayer with dignity while skipping over the whispered worry about an owl call or a dream before a storm. Oral traditions disappear easily from the archive. Still, scattered accounts make it clear that many frontier families lived with a blend of piety, inherited sayings, weather lore, and local caution that was far more textured than a neat sermon alone. A quirky and very human detail from rural winter life is the seriousness with which people sometimes treated little omens while also mocking them. Someone might insist that spilling salt invited bad luck, then laugh while tossing a pinch over the shoulder just in case. Someone else might dismiss signs in the sky and then quietly repeat the old rhyme about red sunsets and weather. Frontier people were practical, yes, but practical people are not immune to ritual. They simply prefer rituals that do not look too fancy. You learn weather lore quickly because it offers the illusion of foreknowledge, and in winter that illusion can feel wonderfully useful. Read the sky at sunset. Watch how smoke rises from the chimney. Note the direction of the wind. Observe whether snow falls dry and powdery or heavy and wet. Listen to older neighbours who can examine clouds and speak as if they have a private arrangement with them. Much of this knowledge had real value, built from long experience. Some of it was less reliable, but all of it gave people a language for anticipating what might come. Then there are the stories. A winter cabin invites storytelling almost as naturally as it invites smoke. The dark outside sharpens the pleasure of voices inside. Tales pass the time, hold attention, teach lessons, and keep people awake just long enough to finish mending, shelling, carving, or waiting for a storm to ease. Some stories are family memories. Some are jokes polished by repetition. Some are moral tales. Some are ghostly enough to delight children and trouble them for exactly the right amount of time before bed. A frontier household without stories would have been a very quiet place, and winter dislikes a vacuum. Ghost lore thrived in many frontier communities, and not only because people were naive. Consider the ingredients: darkness without street lamps, strange animal noises, snow reflecting moonlight in ways that distort distance, cabins settling and creaking, wind probing every crack. Death more familiar than in many modern lives. It would be stranger if no one ever told a tale about footsteps where none should be, or a light in the trees, or a dream that came true in an unsettling way. The frontier had excellent acoustics for the supernatural. At the same time, humour pushed back against fear, not polished drawing-room wit, but plain jokes, teasing, exaggeration, and the kind of laughter that arrives because the alternative is to brood until breakfast. People joked about stubborn livestock, smoky chimneys, failed recipes, boastful neighbours, and the weather itself. A man might claim the cold froze his thoughts. A woman might remark that the bread rose more eagerly than the children did. A child might ask whether the wind was trying to come in for supper. These little sparks of amusement mattered. They let the household breathe. You notice how laughter changes the room physically. Shoulders lower. The fire seems warmer. Someone wipes at their eyes. Even the candlelight feels more alive when faces lift toward it instead of down toward their work. Frontier humour was often edged with irony because life offered such a rich supply of absurdity. You work from dawn until dark to keep warm, then complain that the room is smoky. You pray for visitors, then grumble that they tracked in snow. You save the best candle for a proper evening, then use it to mend a torn stocking. Human beings remained gloriously consistent across centuries. Faith also shaped the calendar within the season. Sundays, holy days, and occasional gatherings broke winter's sameness, even when the observance was modest. A better meal if one could be managed, cleaner clothes, a hymn, a reading, a visit. A moment when the household stood slightly apart from pure necessity, and remembered itself as something more than a machine for chopping wood and carrying water. Sacred time, even observed simply, can rescue a week from becoming one long blur of chores. There were many frontiers, and therefore many beliefs. Protestant practices varied widely. Catholic households brought their own devotions, feast days, and sacred objects. African American communities carried rich spiritual traditions shaped by endurance, memory, and song. Indigenous nations held deep seasonal understandings and ceremonial life rooted in place, kinship, and cosmology, though settler narratives often ignored or misunderstood them. Folk beliefs from German, Scots-Irish, English, French, Spanish, and other backgrounds mingled in different ways depending on who lived nearby. The frontier was not spiritually simple. It was layered. Historians still argue over how much these traditions blended in daily life versus remaining distinct, because the record often preserves public institutions better than the subtle borrowing that happens between neighbours, marriages, midwives, labourers, and children. But it's hard to imagine communities living in proximity through hard winters without some exchange of sayings, remedies, signs, and practices. People borrow what seems to work, especially when weather is rude. Objects in the cabin can carry comfort beyond their material value. A Bible from home, its leather worn smooth at the edges, a cross, medal, or keepsake tucked safely in a box, a family quilt sewn from remembered garments. A song learned from a parent now gone. These are more than possessions, they're anchors. In winter, when the world outside looks stripped down to snow, wood, and sky, small inherited things gain remarkable emotional weight. They remind you that your life did not begin with this cold season and will not end with it either. You feel the textures of these comforts very clearly. The thin paper of a well-used book under your thumb, the smoothness of a spoon passed through many hands, the rough wool of a shawl wrapped tighter during evening prayer, the faint beeswax or tallow scent near a candle, the low hum of a hymn, not beautifully sung perhaps, but sincerely carried. This is how belief often enters the room, through the senses first, through doctrine second. Sometimes endurance takes quieter forms, a woman marking days by small domestic rituals, a man whittling in the same chair each night until a tool handle or toy takes shape, children repeating bedtime verses half from reverence and half from sleepiness, a household keeping the same order for chores even after a rough week because routine itself is stabilizing. Habit can become a kind of liturgy when repeated under pressure. There are evenings when the spirit sags anyway. No reading lifts it. No joke lands properly. The wind will not stop. The room feels close, dim, and tired. On such nights, the frontier lesson is not cheerfulness. It is persistence. Someone still tends the fire. Someone still folds the cloth, banks the embers, sets out tomorrow's bucket, checks the latch, and says goodnight with what strength remains. Endurance is often unimpressive in the moment. It looks like yawning and carrying on. That may be the deepest truth of frontier morale. People were not constantly inspired. They were not always noble, serene, or filled with radiant purpose. They were often worried, cranky, lonely, bored, devout, amused, suspicious, and determined in uneven proportions. What carried them was not a single perfect attitude, but a bundle of practices that kept despair from settling too heavily. A prayer, a weather sign, a half-believed omen, a hymn, a joke, a story, a habit, a shared silence before sleep. And these things had power because winter worked on the mind as surely as it worked on the hands. Long darkness could make trouble seem larger. Snowbound days could narrow the imagination until it contained nothing but the next chore. Belief and folklore widened that inner space. They gave the season shape. They suggested meaning, warning, order, or at least companionship in the unseen. Even humour did its part by refusing to let hardship become sacred in the worst possible way. Late in the evening, the room grows still, the candle has burned lower, the fire glows red beneath its ash. Outside, the night lies thick over the fields, and the stars, if visible, look brittle enough to ring. Inside, voices soften. A final prayer may be spoken. A final joke may earn a tired smile. A child drifts asleep with one hand still wrapped in a quilt edge. An older face in firelight looks lined, patient, and far away for a moment. Perhaps thinking of another winter in another place, You sit with all of it. The faith, the sayings, the stories, the odd little superstitions, the laughter that arrives unexpectedly, the hush that follows. None of it stops the cold by itself. None of it fills an empty barrel or mends a split boot. But without these invisible tools, the season would feel much longer and the cabin much smaller. Winter on the American frontier asked for more than muscle. It asked for inward resources, for forms of courage that could survive in whispers as well as work. So when the fire is finally banked and the last voice fades, you understand why people kept such close company with both prayer and folklore. They were ways of answering the dark without pretending it was not there. They gave shape to fear, dignity to waiting, and a little warmth to the mind when the room itself could offer only so much. On the frontier, that counted as real protection. At some point, without consulting your preferences, winter begins to loosen its grip, not dramatically at first. The cold still bites in the morning. Ice still clings to the bucket rim. Snow still lies in stubborn folds along the fence and under the trees, but the light changes. It lingers a little longer on the yard. The sun, pale for so many weeks, starts to look less decorative and more employed. Water appears where only frost should be. A drip from the roof begins, then another, then a patient irregular tapping that sounds almost suspicious after so much stillness. On the American frontier, the first thaw was not a clean victory. It was a messy negotiation. You step outside and the air feels different at once. Not soft exactly, but less severe. It carries moisture now, a darker smell rising from earth and old leaves hidden beneath the snow. Wood smoke still drifts from chimneys, but it no longer seems to dominate the whole world. The yard, which winter had flattened into white shapes and hard edges, begins to separate into details again. Here is the path, emerging in patches. Here is the wood pile, ringed by slush. Here is the fence rail where one board has leaned all season and now looks embarrassingly obvious in the returning light. This is how spring announces itself on the frontier, by revealing what winter has done. One mainstream truth of frontier life is that surviving a hard winter did not end with relief alone. The thaw exposed damage, shortages, weakness in animals, wear in tools, and human exhaustion that cold weather had merely forced everyone to postpone. Roofs leaked where snow had hidden floors, fences sagged, paths turned to mud, shoes were worn thin, cellars ran low, seed grain had to be guarded carefully. Muscles were tired, tempers sometimes were too. Spring began not with leisure, but with inventory. The snow itself becomes a problem on the way out. Packed drifts soften into heavy masses that slump and slide. Meltwater runs across the yard and underfoot with a chill that goes straight through boots and into the bones. Mud forms with frontier confidence, thick, adhesive, and morally discouraging. A clean frozen path gives way to a yard determined to keep part of every step. Your hem darkens. The smell of wet earth rises rich and cold. Somewhere nearby, a chicken, newly ambitious, scratches at exposed ground as if the entire season had been a misunderstanding. Inside the cabin, the shift can be felt as much as seen. The room remains smoky, warm, and worn, but the light enters at a new angle. It reaches farther across the floor. It catches dust in the air and makes ordinary objects look newly detailed. The table's scars, the patched sleeve hung by the door, the rough grain of the wall. Winter had reduced life to essentials. The thaw lets you notice textures again. Even the sounds change. Water drips outside. Snow slides from the roof with a sudden hush and thump. Birds return in tentative notes, then bolder ones. The world begins rehearsing for a busier season. You begin naturally with inspection. The cabin must be walked around, studied, touched, doubted, a hand against the wall, a glance under the eaves, a pause at the chimney. You look for rot, leaks, settling, loosened chinking, warped boards, cracks widened by cold. Repairs that were impossible in January become urgent in mud season. Roof shingles shifted by ice. Door hinges strained. Window coverings stained or torn. What held against winter may not remain sound for another season unless addressed now. Frontier shelter, like frontier survival itself, never stayed finished for long. The barn and outbuildings demand their turn as well. Boards swollen with damp, roof patches needing replacement, hinges rusted, bedding spoiled, tools left where necessity dropped them months earlier. Animals emerge from winter marked by it. Their coats look rougher or thinner. Their movements are slower in some cases, friskier in others. A cow may stand with that patient, tired look that comes from months of hay and confinement. A horse shakes its head in the softer air and seems to remember motion. Chickens regain a kind of noisy self-importance almost at once. Livestock do not write memoirs, but they reveal a season in posture and appetite. The body carries winter too. You feel it when you lift a bucket and notice the dull soreness that never quite left your shoulders. You see it in hands roughened by cold water, ash, rope, and wood. You hear it in a cough that lingers, though the worst danger has passed. Frontier people often emerge from winter thinner, paler, and more worn than they had entered it. Survival did not always look triumphant. Sometimes it looked tired and busy. Historians still argue over how quickly frontier families could recover economically after severe winters, because outcomes depended on region, crop plans, livestock survival, access to markets, and plain luck. A household that preserved enough food, kept key animals alive, and maintained decent shelter might enter spring worn but stable. Another could emerge on the edge of real trouble, with too little seed, too few supplies, and too much repair work. The same thaw that felt hopeful in one cabin might feel deeply alarming in the next. Seasons were shared, consequences were not. That uncertainty shapes the first warmish days. You check the cellar and count what remains: potatoes sprouting, apples going soft, beans reduced, flour low, salt still precious, seed grain separate, guarded with nearly religious seriousness. To eat it would be to borrow against the future in the most dangerous way. So meals may remain plain even as the air improves. The body senses change before the pantry rewards it. That is one of spring's little jokes. Still, signs of release are everywhere. The creek begins to move more freely, breaking at the edges first, then widening, then carrying bits of old ice away like scraps of a season too stubborn to leave gracefully. Birds call from branches that no longer look quite so dead. Sap may start to rise in the maples if the region allows, bringing with it the strange yearly pleasure of sweetness after a winter defined by salt, starch, and smoke. Children react quickly to these shifts. They hear them, smell them, chase them. A child on a frontier homestead could detect thaw in the spirit before the adults admitted it aloud. The yard becomes a place of retrieval. Things buried all winter return like half-forgotten thoughts. A tool handle lost in snow, a broken hoop, a dropped mitten gone stiff and useless, a board, a toy, a stone path. Evidence of old chores emerges from melt and mud. You recover these objects one by one and feel, with each one, how long the cold had ruled the space. Winter had hidden the world. Thaw hands it back in pieces. There is work in every direction now. Garden plots must be considered. Fields watched as the ground softens enough for planning and later ploughing. Fences repaired before animals test the new season's freedoms with predictable enthusiasm. Water channels noticed, mud managed, seed sorted, tools sharpened, wood supplies rethought. The frontier year does not pause to congratulate anyone for making it through. It merely changes the list of demands. A quirky detail from many rural communities is the emotional power of the first truly useful patch of green. Not a grand meadow, not a whole transformed landscape. Just a spot where grass or shoots begin to show near a wall, along a stream, or beside the manure pile where warmth and moisture conspire in early fertility. People noticed these things. Of course they did, after months of white, grey, brown, and smoke black. Even a little green looked outrageous. The thaw also changes social life. Paths improve by degrees, though mud and swollen creeks create their own obstacles. Still, movement becomes more plausible. News spreads faster. Visits increase. Work exchanges take on spring urgency. A family may need help mending fences or borrowing seed. Another may be planning planting already. With winter's strict confinement easing, the human world starts flowing outward again. You hear more voices outside, more wheels, more animals moving as more doors opening and closing in daylight, and yet there is a strange tenderness in this season of release. The cabin that felt like confinement on some long, dark nights now looks almost protective in memory. Its smoke-darkened walls, low light, rough table, patched blankets, and banked hearth had held life through the worst weeks. You notice its smallness differently now, not as a trap, but as the exact size of the struggle you survived inside it. Frontier comfort was never elegant, but it was real. That realization can arrive in small moments. Standing in the doorway with mud at your boots and sunlight on your sleeve, turning back toward the room and seeing the bed corner, the hearth, the pegs on the wall, the shelf with its reduced stores, the kettle hanging ready. None of it is impressive by grand standards. All of it mattered. The frontier had a stern way of teaching proportion. A little warmth, a little food, a dry roof, a door that shuts, enough wood, enough health, enough luck. What seems small in comfort becomes enormous in hardship. Scholarly uncertainty surrounds another question too. How often did frontier people speak openly about the emotional effects of surviving winter? Relief, fear, gratitude, fatigue, dread of next year. The record is uneven. Many diaries are spare. Letters may downplay suffering or focus on practicalities. Memory, told later, reshapes hardship into story. So historians often infer from fragments, but the fragments suggest something clear enough. Winter left marks not only on property and bodies, but on how people understood security. Once you have counted flour by candlelight through a hard February, comfort acquires new meaning. You see that change in behaviour. Waste offends more deeply. A carelessly opened door draws a sharper warning. Dry wood is stacked with greater satisfaction. Food is valued with renewed seriousness. Children may romp in mud with cheerful disregard, but adults keep one eye on stores, weather, and work ahead. The season has taught its lessons. Whether anyone enjoyed those lessons is another matter. There are pleasures, though, plain and honest ones. Opening the door in a morning light and not being hit by savage air, washing with water that does not punish you quite so thoroughly, hearing birds before the axe, smelling thawed ground, seeing smoke from neighbouring cabins rise into a softer sky, eating one of the last winter meals while imagining what fresh food might soon return, letting the sun warm your back while you mend or sort or simply stand still for one rare minute and take stock. All snorts in the yard and stamps at mud. Chickens gossip noisily beside the shed. Somewhere water runs under old snow with a secretive rush. The roof drips. A distant voice carries farther now in the damp air. Your fingers, still rough, close around a cup warm from the hearth. The steam smells simple and welcome. The cabin around you is worn, but less embattled. The season has shifted from siege to preparation, and that may be the real truth of the frontier thaw. It did not erase winter, it translated it. All the cold days, smoky nights, rationed meals, frozen buckets, patched walls, worried prayers, and weary chores changed into knowledge carried forward. You know more now about the land, the house, the animals, or the weather, and yourself. You know which latch fails in bad cold, which corner of the roof needs watching, how much wood vanishes in one hard week, how little a person can eat and still work, how much a hot drink can mean, how precious ordinary health feels. These are not sentimental discoveries, they are expensive ones. So when the last heavy patches of snow sink lower and the yard shows its battered face again, you do not step into spring unchanged. You step into it educated, perhaps humbled, certainly less likely to mistake convenience for entitlement. Frontier winter had stripped life down to essentials with brisk efficiency. Thaw lets you rebuild outward from them. You move through the day with mud on your boots, smoke still in your coat, and the season turning all around you. The sky lifts. The trees hold the slightest promise at their tips. Water keeps moving. The land is no longer locked, only difficult in a new direction. Somewhere ahead lie planting, insects, sweat, growth, storms, and all the tasks that belong to open ground. But here, in this damp bright interval, you stand in the frontier's version of relief, not ease, not abundance. Relief earned slowly, in rough hands and ordinary persistence, and as evening comes, softer now, less cruelly abrupt, you look at the cabin, the yard, the fields beyond, and understand what surviving winter has really done. It has reduced comfort to its truest elements, and then returned them to you one by one: light, water, motion, sound, air that no longer bites so hard, earth showing through, a roof that held, a fire that lasted, body still moving through the chores of another season. Now the night settles more gently. The cabin grows quiet around you, no longer under siege, only resting after its long labour. Outside, the last traces of snow fade into the dark earth, and the dripping from the roof slows to a softer rhythm. You can let your mind loosen a little. You can feel the warmth near the hearth without measuring it quite so anxiously. The rough blankets seem less like armour and more like comfort again. Even the smoke in the rafters feels familiar, almost kind. You breathe in the scent of wood, earth, and cooling ash. Somewhere beyond the door, water moves steadily through the dark, carrying winter away in small silver threads. The animals settle. The trees stand quiet. The sky deepens above the homestead, calm and open. And you, tired and wiser now, let the season drift from your shoulders. The cold months have passed into memory, leaving behind their hard lessons and their strange gratitude. In this stillness, with the land beginning to wake and the cabin holding one last circle of warmth, you can finally rest. Sleep comes softly here, under a gentler sky, while the frontier itself seems to exhale